I mean, think about how many Taylor Swifts probably never become Taylor Swift because they grow up in a low-income community. There isn't a strong music program at their school, so there's never exposed. And unfortunately, that idea ends up dying and that passion ends up turning into nothing.
Say you were in Venezuela and you were a very wealthy family and you had generational wealth. You saw that wiped out in a matter of months. Everything that your father's father, your father, and your entire family has worked for, gone like that. Today, we have a very special guest, my friend Kyle Herron, who is the co-founder of Frontier Mining, which is a leading cryptocurrency mining and hosting company. In this episode, we'll be discussing Kyle's journey as an entrepreneur, as well as his predictions for the future of Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin's price, and artificial intelligence. During this podcast, you'll hear some of the inside secrets of the entertainment and events industry, including how negotiations for artists and events actually operate. As someone with a wealth of knowledge about Bitcoin mining, Kyle addresses some of the most common misconceptions about our industry and gives you his bold predictions for its future. Finally, we discuss the importance of understanding how Bitcoin will affect everyone's lives, whether you fully understand it or not. Overall, Kyle is an incredibly interesting, knowledgeable, and passionate human being, and I'm grateful to share this entertaining, thought-provoking, and informative conversation with you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. It's one that you'll want to watch till the end. All right, so I have some fun questions to start off here with. So they're kind of like rapid-fire questions that are not crypto-related or completely like mining-related. Some are kind of crypto. So the first one is if you had to add one feature to the iPhone, what would it be?
That's awesome. Well, I'll first off start off by saying, Will, that I really appreciate you making this happen, man. It's great to see you again. Great to be connected again. And obviously, it's been a pleasure to watch Saz Mining grow its footprint in the industry. So really excited about everything that you guys are doing over there. Back to the rapid fire question, though, the more important thing, the one feature I'd add to the iPhone. The first one that comes to mind, honestly, is I really want to send later function on iMessage. This is not the most innovative thing in the world, but every other app that I use has it. Like my email has it, Telegram has it, Microsoft Teams has it, and so forth. And with iMessage and with the crypto industry, we're working till 2, 3 a.m. at night, right? But I don't necessarily want to reach out to my client at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. So I'd much prefer a send later function on iMessage. There's probably a lot more interesting ones that we could dig into over the course of this conversation, but that would actually make a difference in my life right now.
Yeah, that's a good answer. The last person I spoke to, they came up with a feature that would almost be like a discipline, like screen restriction type of application. So just, if you're using social media or something, you can toss it on and then not.
Well, I've seen
a lot of wasted hours.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, I've seen some really clever ideas online. Like people have put, for example, it's like the screen time function that's currently in the iPhone where you can block certain apps at certain times of the day. But if you try to break through the screen time function, which you can do just by tapping a button on your phone, it charges your debit card automatically.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, and then you start getting charged for every maybe 15-minute increment that you're on Instagram. You get charged like $5, right? And I don't know exactly where the funds go. Maybe the owner of the Screen Time app just becomes rich because people can't stay away from the apps that typically distract them. But yeah, I mean, my phone is honestly locked down most of the time. I have all those tools on, but I can see for the average user that it probably wouldn't be a bad idea.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I actually, it's funny. So two things. The first one is I actually have that app and I was using it for a while, but as you mentioned, it's just very easy to go through and there was actually no economic incentive put in against it. So I would just have to put in a password or just be like, I'm sure I want to move forward. And it was no problem. So yeah, the money side of it actually puts a real incentive behind it rather than just one additional click.
No, seriously. I mean, I love the idea of tying dollars to actions that you take in your life. I'm a big fan that if I'm choosing between, say, 2 different meetings to go to, I ask myself which one is the higher value meeting that has the higher dollar output from me and my company, right? And so I look at the phone the same way. And if I'm on Instagram, ultimately I'm taking dollars away from something else that I can do with my life. So it really should almost be like an opportunity cost feature. I saw something the other day with a really clever integration for Google Calendar, where the idea was that every meeting that goes on your calendar, there's a dollar value that's tied to it. And then you ask yourself, and then there was a little function on Google Calendar that would click, that would say, this meeting is worth $400 of everyone's time, right? Or do you want to just send an email and cancel the meeting? And I'm like, this needs to be a feature tomorrow because the amount of burnt hours that are unnecessarily spent in meetings when in reality it probably could be an email or a Telegram message or something like that is just ridiculous to me.
Oh, that's so true. I mean, that's one of the things too that I've had to become more and more cognizant of. And to start, I think naturally some people are more structured. They really, really like having meetings, and then others are more of And it's the more entrepreneurial side, I would say, is just like, you know what, let's just get it done. Do we really need a meeting? This is going to take everyone's time.
Yep.
And with, in particular, just these, for example, team calls, or when you have a lot of people from your team on, those are the most expensive meetings. And so just making sure that when you have those, that there's a true impact and you know the reason why you're having it. You're not just burning everyone's time.
100%, man. I mean, this is like the old Elon Musk adage of basically only have a meeting if you absolutely have to have a meeting, and then whoever's in that meeting, make sure that they're actually contributing quality information. Otherwise, they're burning their own time and they're burning your time too. And not to mention, like, let's be honest with ourselves. The most difficult part that I found with meeting structuring is that we may have a 45-minute discussion, but I know that probably the first 10 to 15 minutes, we're just going to be catching up, chatting, talk about personal life, etc. The final 5 to 10 minutes are probably going to be wrap up. So we know of that 45 minutes, we probably already lost 20 to 25 minutes in just really unnecessary dialogue. I'm not saying that relationship building is a bad thing, but I'm saying that it can be selectively done. It doesn't necessarily have to be done in every single meeting. And then the other challenge, of course, is too, it takes me 30 minutes to prepare for that meeting and then another 30 to 45 minutes to follow up with that meeting. So what could look like on your calendar a 45-minute meeting could easily turn to 2 hours of your day. We only have 24 hours in a day. We're sleeping for 8 of them. We have 16 to work theoretically, but we probably want to get in the gym. We probably want to call our mom. We have other things we want to do. So it's just amazing how quickly that time shrinks to almost nothing. And if you're not highly efficient, like, your day can go out the window before you even wake up.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And also, just hearing you talk about that, there are all these different parts in the day where you just might have like a 30-minute dead zone, and it's really hard to get into flow, get into deep work if you only have that amount of time. You really can't. So all of a sudden, if you have all these meetings and you don't want to have to be going back to back, and then you have 30-minute increments outside of it, it just makes it very hard for actual deep work to get done, not only for you, 100%. But for other people on the team.
Yeah, and what's interesting too is if you really start understanding how your body works and you start understanding your chronotype and the types of hours of the day that you're most productive, oftentimes what ends up happening is that those hours of the day where you can really dig into deep quality work, like what you're referring to, Will, is the same time of the day that someone else wants to take a phone call with you. So most people from roughly 8 to 11 a.m. are highly, highly productive. Like, those are the deep work hours. If you're assigning a project to your team, have them do it within those hours versus doing it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when they're coming down from a whole day of work. The problem is, with the world that we live in now, is everybody also wants to schedule meetings in those windows as well. So what ends up happening is that you take a really highly productive person, you stack their calendar with 2 to 3 meetings in the morning, and before you know it, it's 1 o'clock their time. And they have no energy to get through the rest of the day. So I've just found, like, the way that you structure your day and the way you help your team structure their day is so incredibly critical to company productivity, because the reality is that humans are extremely inefficient creatures. Thank goodness we've got things like ChatGPT that we'll talk about later in this conversation to rely on, right? Because humans themselves, like, we can only get so far on our own energy. That's why coffee, tea, et cetera, is our natural crutch.
Oh yeah, well, I'm joining you there on the coffee, and I'm actually
so
pumped to speak with you about the AI ChatGPT advancements. Actually, one of the first things that I thought after using the tool and playing around with it, I remember you and we had a really good conversation a while back, and I just remembered being blown away by not only your framework on how you view things, but particularly your views on technology and that whole side of things. So that's actually going to be what I'm thinking is like the last segment of this conversation, but I'm so excited for that. To kick it off, I was thinking that rather than just asking you about how you got involved in crypto, really trying to understand what you were like growing up. And so the first question that I'd like to ask you is, let's imagine that you and I were tossed in a time machine and we're put back into high school. So you and I were best friends in high school. At that point in time, how do you see yourself? What are you like as a person? How do other people see you at that point in time in high school?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really, really great question. And I enjoy taking time to sort of dig back and reflect on earlier phases of my life, because recently what I did, Will, that I thought was really powerful with a couple of peer mentors of mine, is I did what's called a lifeline activity. And basically what a lifeline activity is you take like a whiteboard like the one behind me, and you basically draw a center line through it, and that's sort of your neutral line, right? So we'll consider that to be 0. And then what you do is you plot, and you consider that sort of it's a neutral line that's moving as a timeline, essentially. So let's say we start with you and I are born early 90s, right? Will, you're probably a 93, 94 baby, something like that.
Pretty close, not 96.
96. Okay, so I'm a 93. We're right in the same realm. So we'd start our timeline at 1993, 1996 in your case, end it in 2022. And based on this timeline, you're going to plot all of the high and low points of your life, right? And it's really fascinating to do it. And so everything above the line would be considered a high point, and the further above the line, the more of a high point it is, and same for the low points, right? And what's really fascinating is when you kind of look at your life from that holistic perspective, you realize how critical every phase of your life is and how important even the most minute decisions you make are. So when I think about something like high school, which for me now is over a decade away, I still look back at that as being a really pivotal period in my life. And I will get back to your core question of who I was, but the reality in answering your question is I didn't really know who I was at that time. Right. And so for a long time, I said, well, that wasn't really a relevant time in my life. I was figuring myself out. It didn't really create any long-term impact in who I became today until I look back going into my 30s now and saying, what did that actually mean to me? And I think an activity like a Lifeline activity helps to illuminate that. But to answer your question, and like I shared a minute ago, I frankly didn't really know who I was in high school. There was a lot of I want to try a little bit of everything attitude, and there was a lot of I just want to fit in with what everyone else wants attitude. So it was a little bit of both. I was pulled in two different directions, and part of the challenge for me is I grew up in a really esteemed community. My parents were fortunate enough, they're not necessarily the wealthiest people in the world, but they were fortunate enough to buy into a housing market before it lifted off in a community that had a really strong public school system. So essentially what ended up happening for me is I grew up around a lot of people who were extremely affluent, right? Extremely intelligent. Our high school launched lots of kids off to Ivy Leagues and other top tier universities throughout the country. And so for me, there was a certain standard that I had to adhere to in terms of what I needed to achieve in my life because I grew up in this community. That was just sort of an unspoken standard that was created. And then on the other hand, you also just have all of the ebbs and flows and movement to high school itself. So I was drawn into this idea of I need to be great just because of where I grew up, but I also need to fit into the conventional high school model. And so all that context in mind, that led me down two different paths. One was that I was a total jock, right? So I played three sports growing up. Basically all the way through to my senior year of high school. I do look back and really value those years and cherish those years because I think they lend me a certain competitive edge that I still carry with me into my professional life, although I've toned it down a lot since then. And of course, I really believe strongly in fitness and taking care of your body, and that's another layer of conversation we can dig into. So I'm grateful for that time, but it maybe took me away from what my real loves and focuses were. So I had this sort of jock mentality, right? And this I want to fit in with everybody mentality that was really, really deeply implemented into my psyche and into my brain. And then on the other side of the table, I had this longing and deep desire for technology, right? And I remember, gosh, all the way back to like when the first Game Boy Color came out, I was just so captivated by the idea that there was so much data that could be contained in something that could fit within your pocket. That was just such a cool concept to me, right? And so that was a lot of what took me down my entrepreneurial journey. But if you would have known me in high school, you probably wouldn't have known me as that person. You would have known me as, oh, this guy is the athlete. He hangs out in maybe a more popular, a prominent circle. But on the inside, I was just a closeted nerd ready to break out into the world.
That's so funny. Hearing that, I actually would consider that. I feel like we would have been very good friends in high school, I guess is what I'm saying, because I was the same type of way. I've always been super into sports, and hearing that timeline activity, that's fascinating. I've actually never heard of that exercise, but as you were talking through it, I was almost imagining, what are those high points? What are those low points? It probably gives you a really good just view and understanding on being able to take a step back. Whenever
Absolutely.
You're in the middle of something, you have a lot of times, many of the times, let's say if I was doing the exercise right now, I look back, some of the most difficult, darkest times in those moments, I look back now and I'm super grateful for. And some of those very, very high moments, they were great, but those weren't necessarily an important step within my journey to where I am today. And I'm sure that the same type of thing today, I'm going to look back years from now and then be grateful for some of the tough times and not really think that some of the highs matter as much.
Yeah. I mean, it's really amazing to me, man, how our life is so incredibly finite, right? This idea that we're fortunate enough to have 100 human years on this earth in the grand scheme of things is almost nothing. In the universal scale of things, we are truly, legitimately less than a speck of dust, right? At least when you bring it back into our world. And so it reminds you of the importance of every action you take, right? Because in reality, we're already so incredibly small as it is. Therefore, my argument is that although we are small relative to the universe, every action we take is small relative to us, but we still matter in the greater scheme of the universe. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? And this goes deeper into like my philosophical belief in this world. But I'm just such a strong believer that at my core, there's a component of faith that there's not a clear answer to why I feel this way. But my deepest feelings tell me that there has to be a reason that we're here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And it kind of dates back to things like Darwinism, right? And this whole concept of survival of the fittest. And the reality is that if you and I were not here, Will, there would be a specific reason why Mother Nature chose us not to be here, right? And so because of that, I just feel like it's almost our responsibility to take responsibility over every action of our life because we're gifted with this opportunity, right? And although we may seem small in the greater scheme of things, we're everything within the greater scheme of us, right? And so because of that, that's why I love those lifeline activities and those opportunities to reflect back on earlier phases of our life, because it all matters, right? There's all a greater reason and a greater purpose as to why we exist. And when you get the opportunity to analyze all of those, what may have seemed like minute portions of your journey, you realize how incredibly critical almost every single every single day of your life really is.
Yeah. So a couple of things there. First is how easy it is to just get into a routine. Like every single decision, sometimes you might not, or at least this has happened to me, where let's say that you're doing something and you should do one thing, but it's easier to do the other. Like you should take that cold shower. You should go to the gym today.
Right.
That you should eat the salad rather than the cookie. But then you're like, oh, well, I've been so good about it for the past couple weeks. I'll just cheat this one time. It's not going to make a big difference.
Yep.
But then all of a sudden, just that thought in your mind that it's okay to cheat sometimes becomes such a big thing compared to just that one isolated event. Because then all of a sudden, every time lunch rolls around, you might be saying, okay, well, I ate the salad, I'm going to eat the cookie. And then just those types of things can spiral in a good way and in a bad way. It's like if you get 1% better every single day and you let that compound, you won't even recognize where you are in 3 years, or
I totally
honestly
agree,
a much shorter period of time. But then the same thing, it's like, let's say you have a job and then all of a sudden you get fired from your job and then you are trying to deal with the pain. And so then you start drinking alcohol and then you start going down this whole path. And before you know it, your life could spiral in a bad way as well. And the final piece as well that I want to talk about there that you mentioned is your life philosophy. And I want to dive into how you came about to what you just explained, your life philosophy. Has it changed at all? How did it change from high school going into college versus after college? And before you answer, I'll give you a little bit of a view that I don't necessarily know where it came from, but I was similar to you in the sense that very early on, I realized, our entire planet, everything is less than a speck of dust. We're very insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe. And in some type of weird way, I don't know why I interpreted it this way, but I interpreted it as you should go for whatever it is that you want to do and give it 110%. Because a lot of times when people don't do something, they won't do it because they're scared or they don't know what's going to happen or they're afraid of being embarrassed. And especially as a kid, when you're growing up, I mean, social humiliation, embarrassment, that is a big fear of yours. And one of the things that I saw firsthand is I had certain friends that might have been further on one side where they would go and they would just not ever try anything, and they would let the fear paralyze them. And then I'd see others that would actually go for it, do it, even if they were scared, say, hey, look, I'm going to try. I'll let the chips fall where they may. And I don't know what it is that necessarily prompted that, but I think that when you look at just how insignificant we are, you can look at it in the lens of, okay, it's so insignificant, no matter what fear of isolation or embarrassment or whatever that you're worried about, it doesn't really matter because in the grand scheme of things, no one's going to remember it in 100 years, like honestly, like 100 seconds probably. So you might as well just go for it and let the chips fall where they may.
I mean, it was actually there's a passage that I read every single morning as I kind of set the intentions for my day. I try to take a really mindful approach, really into every action I take, but particularly in terms of the setup of my day. I have a period of time where I do a little little meditation, a little intention setting, a little gratitude practice before I step into my space for the day. And one of the pieces that I was reading this morning is that at best, the past is a distant memory because I can hardly even remember what I said 2 minutes ago, right? And I think to your point, it all comes back to this this approach that I've taken to my life, where I look at it from the same perspective that you do, and a lot of it ultimately is correlated with risk, right? When you end up breaking it down and risk as an entrepreneur, but I always like to ask people, when it comes to your interest in risk, right? Whether you're a super risk averse person or not, why do you feel that way? And there's some people that will just say, I don't have enough money in my bank account. I don't have enough cash flow coming in. I'm in an industry that may not be totally certain. There's a lot of different reasons. But when you really break it down to the risk takers versus the non-risk takers, it all depends on how they look at the future of their journey and the future of humanity's journey, right? And so the perspectives you shared, I totally agree with. They're really, really interesting to think about, because one perspective is we're so small and we're so insignificant that nothing that we do really matters. So take as much risk as you possibly can. But the converse of that, Will, is we're so insignificant and nothing really matters. So don't do anything with your life because it won't even matter in 10 minutes anyway. Right. Because like I said a second ago, the past, even 2 minutes ago, I can hardly remember what I said. So why does any action even matter in the first place? But then I always date back to or I always kind of fall back on what I shared a minute ago, which is that if you were not supposed to be here, you wouldn't be here. People have this perception that the world revolves around us, around our towns, around our states, around our country. But in reality, the world revolves around something much bigger than us. And if Mother Nature wants to take us out, Mother Nature will take us out. Mother Nature would have taken us out a long time ago. We're not just insignificant in terms of our placement in the universe, we're insignificant in terms of our placement on the planet. Like, we're so small and powerless as creatures that it's really a question of like, why should we even be here in the first place? Because we sort of feel in a lot of ways like we're kind of at the end of the evolutionary cycle in terms of what can be developed on Earth, right? Like, we're not necessarily contributing to the Earth's longevity at this point. In fact, humans are probably taking more away from the Earth. So again, it all comes back to, so then why are we here, right? And what I know for sure is that there is a reason. I can't tell you what that reason is. That reason might be different for you. It might be different for me. It might be different for my friend. It might be different for my girlfriend, my mother, my father, and all the people that live in my city and my town and so forth. But I know that we all are here for a reason. And because of that, because we have this opportunity, this gift to just be here in the first place and just wake up and breathe in the air and live this life, then I know that I have a purpose. I don't know what that purpose is yet, but I know that I have a purpose. And that's my motivation behind everything that I do ultimately, is it's kind of a process of discovering what that purpose is and what that reason is. And a lot of people in philosophy will refer to that as self-actualization. It's a process of understanding what your potential is and then reaching it, right? But first you have to understand what it can potentially be. And it starts ultimately with remembering that you are here for a reason. We don't know what that reason is. There's lots of ways to fill in the answer to that question, but we know we're here for a reason, because if Mother Nature, Earth, the universe, et cetera, didn't want us, we would not be able to wake up in the morning.
Yeah. And so going off of that, as to, purpose for being here, reason for doing everything that you do, I really want to hear about your entrepreneurial journey. In preparing for this conversation here, I learned quite a bit about your background that I didn't know before going and doing that research, because you haven't always been in the crypto industry working with mining. You've been an entrepreneur and done other things before that. And one of the things that seems like a very interesting topic that I've actually never really dove in depth in is the entertainment industry. And that's one part of the conversation that I want to dive into initially. So maybe let's start by having you talk about the earlier stages of your entrepreneurial journey. And then whenever it gets into that, promotion aspect, we can start diving into some of the details. I'm personally just very, very curious how that world works, because I see it from the outside. It seems very opaque. And I feel like now I get to talk with someone who was on the inside and get the inside scoop here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, it was a fascinating journey, and I hate to bring everything back to my core life philosophies, but a lot of the decisions and the path that you got to learn about that I took was based off these core life philosophies that I follow. So, how did I land in that industry? It was a lot of it was ultimately going back to the question that I had mentioned that I typically share with others when it comes to risk in life and the evaluation of risk, which is just asking what your why is. Like, what's your motivator in life, right? So I took a couple different things that led me to the music industry. I took what my why was, which I'll share in a moment, and then number two, I took that general life philosophy as I'm here for a reason, and my first step in this journey is discovering what that reason is, right? And I knew at a young age that what I really, really enjoyed doing was not necessarily being the person who had the great idea. And that was such a humbling experience to realize that I may not be that person. That may not be my gift. Being the innovator and the ideator may not be necessarily where my skill sets lie. A lot more. I've discovered over time that a lot more of what I've been gifted with is the ability to integrate with others who have great ideas and are great thinkers, right? And so when it came to the music industry, that just felt like a really natural fit, because you have such an abundance of creators, but you don't have necessarily an abundance of facilitators, right? With every great creator, you need to take their canvas that may be the size of a building and bring it all the way down to an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and say, no, I want you to fit all of your ideas onto this, versus just let them run for infinity. And so that's what kind of initially drew me towards the industry. Was I saw an opportunity, number one, to work towards my reason, and number two, to really start to nurture this skill that I was interested in, which was becoming a facilitator of great creatives, right? But ultimately, the reason that I even bothered looking at that space versus looking at another was because along my journey in my career, I faced a really challenging point in my earlier phase of my collegiate journey where I made the wrong decision and I went to the wrong college, right? And it was a big problem for me because I had grown up again in a community where, academics and success, there was a really, really high bar for it, right? And so the idea of going to a college and then leaving that college was very, very taboo. When I came back home after that poor collegiate experience, I really had to ask myself, ultimately, what do you care about in life? And I dumbed it down even further thanks to a question from my parents, which is, what do you just like in life to begin with? Right. And I knew I really liked music. Now, I wasn't necessarily someone who had like headphones and all the time and was always listening to music, but I always just felt just a super intimate connection whenever I heard music, whenever I went to a concert. And I can say that a lot of my friendships, life experiences, opportunities, et cetera, have been centered around the entertainment and the music industry. I think that was in part due to the fact that I grew up in Los Angeles, so there was just an abundance of it there. And it also just happened to be that during really low points in my life, people who were in that space came around and picked me up. So I think there were a lot of different factors that led me to it, in terms of my core life philosophies, in terms of my general interests in life, and then also just in terms of the wonderful people that have surrounded me and have kind of nurtured me into that space. But in terms of how that journey got kicked off, so it started with all those different motivators, and then it ultimately started to manifest initially when I was in college into just figuring out how I could break in. Breaking into the music industry is not breaking the entertainment industry as a whole. There's not really a clear-cut path. There's two different paths that you can take, right? You can take the path of a creative, right? And you can just be naturally a great guitar player or something along those lines. Or the other path that you can take is that you know someone, right? I didn't have either of those. I'm not naturally inclined to be great with instruments or any real strong form of creativity. I mean, I think I'm creative, but not necessarily in the conventional sense, right? And secondarily, I didn't really have any deep connections in that industry. So I just said to myself, the best thing that I can start doing, and I advise a lot of young people in their career, young entrepreneurs, et cetera, is the first thing you have to do is show that you can actually do it. And thanks to the internet, we can have, for example, for Will to start a podcast, he doesn't need Joe Rogan to say, hey, Will can start a podcast. Will can just start the podcast. So for me, I said, I'm just going to go try a blog out, right? So I started with an initial blog called Wings to the Minds. It was based off a quote that I've always loved, which if I can remember it, I'll share it. It's by Plato. It's something to the effect of music gives soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything. So I always love that quote. Took that concept of wings to the mind, and I launched this kind of blog, right? And I initially started just by kind of pouring out some of my thoughts, opinions on new artists, the industry as a whole. I was really plugged into the electronic dance community at the time, so I kind of had a sense of what was happening in the space. And I took a totally different perspective in that industry versus being, the guy that would go to shows and take all of these wild substances. I was really studying the business behind these concerts and these experiences and who was forming them. So I started to write on those. And then ultimately that led me to partnering up with a group that was actually putting on those concerts. I met the CEO. I started to talk with him at a couple of the shows I was at, and I was really captivated by what he was doing. We ended up forming a relationship, and through that process, one of my closest friends growing up he and I said, hey, Kyle, what if we just went and tried this on our own? We saw that this guy, Brandon, can do it with his company. What if we just attempted to do the same thing? It doesn't seem overly complex, the concept of putting on a concert. And so that led to the formation of one of my first formal companies, which is a company called Beats for Better that I founded years ago. And the concept behind Beats for Better was twofold. So number one, we wanted to put on concerts. We thought the idea was really cool. I was already a little bit plugged into the space at the time. We knew a lot of artists. We'd been around the community for a while, and we just wanted to give the opportunity really for young talent to have a platform that they can show themselves off on. Because again, the hardest things for creatives is to facilitate their creativity into a business. So I was really, really drawn by that. And then, the second piece of it too is we had a philanthropic component that we really believed in. We believed that artists were missing a couple of different things, and one of the big things that we felt like artists were missing is that there's a lot of talent within the U.S. and abroad that just isn't ever tapped into because the opportunity is not provided. I mean, think about how many Taylor Swifts probably never become Taylor Swift because they grow up in a low-income community. There isn't a strong music program at their school, so there's never exposed. And unfortunately, that idea ends up dying, and that passion ends up turning into nothing. Right. And that's why people generally say that some of the richest places in the world are a graveyard, right, Will? Because that's where all ideas go to die. But you can catch that and fix that problem early if you insert yourself into the lives of the youth really, really young. So that was a big component of what we did with Beat for Better, is that we wanted to insert ourselves in the lives of young, talented creatives, right, and provide them with a portion of our proceeds from our concerts so that we could fund various programs that they were getting involved in. And then the other side, we wanted to create this platform for artists to launch off on. So that launched Beats for Better, and we started running that business for a couple of years. Learned a lot along the way. I will leave space for questions about the music industry because there's just about everything, and very, very similar to your and my journey in the crypto and the mining space, Will. It's an industry that feels like it's been around forever, but it's just as young as a startup in many ways, because there's so many aspects of the space that just are not formalized, because you have this weird mix of really what feel like startups, so these young emerging talent, and then you have these legacy institutions, and the legacy institutions, their job is basically to find the best, the next best young emerging talent, and before that emerging talent becomes savvy enough in business to go snatch up a really nasty deal with them and basically destroy a lot of their opportunities for creativity, right? So it's a very strange space that ultimately what was illuminated to me throughout that process is that young artists, again, need their creativity facilitated into real business. Otherwise, they're going to get hurt early in their journey. And so after starting to understand that aspect of the industry, we were really keen to get in the artist management space with Beats for Better, because we wanted to work with these young entrepreneurs that were artists, but still really fell in that entrepreneur category. And again, help them facilitate their creativity into business. But I knew that the only way that I was going to be able to do that was also to understand how the corporate structure worked in the space. So while I was building this, working my way into the startup world, I also was working my way into the corporate world. And that's when I started to work within Sony's Columbia Records. And that was a really, really interesting experience. That was kind of at the end of the journey with Beats for Better, where I started to tap into that world. And there's so many aspects of it I can help to answer, but that starts to get into the promotion space. So I'll turn it back to you, Will. But there's more to be shared there.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I feel like I could talk with you and listen to your stories all day, because I'll give you let's take a step back. I'll give you my view on it, like
Sure.
coming into this conversation. So the way that I see the landscape, I think that you laid it out very well, where you have this huge pool of creatives, people who are out there that need a good manager or need a team behind them to really get their message across. And it's been interesting because as social media, technologies, all these things have evolved, I feel like the actual business model behind the music industry and behind these different entrepreneurs and creatives has had to evolve. And so when you look at, very early days before the internet, before social media, things like that, it seems like it's a no-brainer. You need one of these labels, you need one of these companies behind you if you want to become very big. And it's one of the same reasons why it seems like you have one person in the spotlight and you're like, what makes that person so special? I know a lot of people are very good looking, who can sing, who've got talent, who can dance. What is it about this one person that really makes them shine? And at the end of the day, it's the same thing with a company. If you've got a good team behind you, you're going to be able to do a lot versus if you're just out there on your own slugging away. And so taking it to your experience, I do want to hear if you can give a particular type of story about someone that you've worked with, or something that that kind of outlines a story that outlines from start to finish what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
But before you give that story, I also, if you can include it in the story, if it's relevant, I'm very curious as to how the structuring and negotiations between the creatives and the actual companies operates, because you always hear about these companies and these creatives, and you hear about these stories where things don't go really well, right? And I think it goes back to what you mentioned, where you can be a young, very talented singer or DJ, whatever you may be, and you'll just run into a very savvy businessman or a very savvy company that understands the ins and outs and have negotiated hundreds of contracts, and you're out there, it's your first time, you're good, but you have no idea what's going on. You're most likely struggling financially, and you are almost reliant on one of these companies. And I think today it's a little bit less so. I mean, that's just my guess, just because you do have platforms like SoundCloud or Spotify or TikTok, places where you can put your content out there and be seen without a middleman. But I'm very curious as to if you have any stories that you can kind of illuminate what's going on here and what your perspective that you've ultimately gained from doing this and working in the industry, what your perspective is today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it will feel very similar to the startup tech space, right? Because ultimately that's what these two industries are. They're two industries that both technology and entertainment have been around for a really, really long time, but there's constantly new people that are trying to enter into the space, right? So unlike, consumer goods, like unlike like Kleenex, for example, which is, or Clorox, these businesses that have been around for hundreds of years, very little innovation in the space, tech and entertainment are constantly changing. Right. And so because of that, you constantly get new participants, and new participants always means more industry vulnerability, right? Because it means someone's probably going to get hurt because someone who's been around is going to try to take advantage of them. It's unfortunately the nature of a capitalistic society, and it's also unfortunately the nature of a creative, because creatives typically want one thing: push their message out to the world as much and as far as they can. If they make money doing it, generally they don't actually care. That's not usually the thing that gets them out of bed in the morning. And because of that, that's part of the reason that contractual structures can look really ugly for creatives, because they're not coming into it with the mindset of, I'm looking to protect future generational wealth. I'm looking to get, a reasonable amount of equity in this final entity that we form. They're just thinking, what's my fastest path to distributing my message as far as possible, however that looks. I'll think about all the business stuff later. Or, in my opinion, the creative should never be thinking about the business stuff, and they should be able to fully open themselves up to whatever downloads they're receiving to the universe that they want to push through their message. The other issue I see is that when you say to a creative, hey, I want you to look at a contract, they don't even have the mental capacity to be able to download that information and really think about it strategically, because their brains don't operate like yours and I do. Well, a true creative's brain is not analytical. They're thinking with a totally different portion of what exists up in their head. And because of that, you end up in a lot of scenarios where artists get in big trouble because they aren't thinking strategically enough. But then the secondary argument is, should they even be thinking strategically enough? And like I said, I don't believe that. Getting back to your question, though, about where I've seen this actually play out in the course of my life, a classic example was actually my college roommate. And so this was all through kind of my journey as in the music industry. And the final school that I ended up at, I was a transfer student. So I had lived in some on-campus housing that had other transfer students in it. Well, the transfer student that I was living with was a 28-year-old. And you don't really see that. He's a junior in college, right? So it's not something you see every day, a 28-year-old transfer student living in on-campus housing. But what's fascinating, Will, and this just goes to show how interesting the universe will just drop little things in your life. But I was chasing the music industry, and he had just gotten booted out of the music industry because of a bad contract. So he was a really talented musician in high school, had this band that he had formed, and they were to the point where they were getting national notoriety. And this is, by the way, pre-SoundCloud, pre-TikTok, pre-all that. Those platforms were really, really early stage at the time, because this was several years ago. So he starts his band in high school, doing really well. One of the major labels, I think it was Republic, I can't remember who it was, came to him and said, hey, we really like what you're doing. We want to give you a 3-album deal. But here's the problem. And again, this is the challenge with these young entrepreneurs. I put it in quotes because they're artists, but they really are entrepreneurs because they're responsible for protecting their businesses. So this major label comes to them and says, hey, we really like what you did. We want to give you a 3-album deal, but here are the terms of the deal. And this is something in the industry known as a 360 contract. They're very, very common in the music industry. They're also very common in other entertainment, other sectors of the entertainment industry. But a 360 deal is basically exactly what it sounds like. In this case, the record label comes in and they say, we're going to take all creative rights from your work for these 3 albums. So you're basically going to commit to us 3 albums. We own your name, your likeness, your brand, everything for these 3 albums. Once the 3 albums are produced, we let you off the hook. You can have all of your creative freedom back, right? Now, here's where these artists get in trouble. So they sign into a deal like that. And this is exactly what happened to my friend Steven. They signed to a deal like that. And the record label says, awesome, we think you're doing great. Here's a budget for your first album. Go shoot a couple music videos. Have a lot of fun with it, right? And then they come back and they say, okay, great, album's done. Music videos are done. Let's go put this out in the world. And they put it out in the world and it doesn't do very well, right? And the audience doesn't receive it very well. They go back to the record label, and in a traditional startup world, that's called product testing. So we put our product out in the world. The world says, we don't love it. Great, bring the product back. Let's refine it, clean it up, and kick it out again. It doesn't work like that in the music industry. Product goes out, doesn't work, comes back to the record label. Hey, record label, we need another $400,000 to produce another album, more music videos, et cetera, to go test the audience again. The record label says, we didn't really like our return on invested capital for that first album. So we're going to wait for a little bit. And in the world of a 360 contract, waiting can be years, right? So an artist can say, I'm ready for the second album. And the record label can say, we're just going to wait on it for a couple of years. Well, what happens to a lot of artists happened to my friend Steven, where they shelf you, right? And they say, we'll get back to you when we're ready. And what ends up happening is they never get back to you, right? But the problem is you sign a deal that basically indefinitely gives them the ability to control your creative freedom and everything around your brand until those other 2 albums get produced. Well, if they never get produced, they fully own your name and your likeness. Why does the record label do this? Well, they basically get to decrease competition in the market, right? So they say, great, we pulled this artist out. This artist is ours. They're no longer going to compete with other people on our label. Awesome. For the artist, they're in complete trouble. And most artists, what they have to do, you'll see a couple different things happen. So in the case of my friend, he didn't have enough money or big enough attorneys or whatever. So he just said, we have to shut this band down and go start a new band. Completely rebuild our Instagram, Facebook, our entire audience, and go basically create a new sound and relaunch into the world. On the other hand, you'll have stories like Frank Ocean. Frank Ocean's one of my favorite artists, and what he decided to do, he was locked in a 360 deal. Now, he had a little bit more strength in this deal because he was a little bit more well-known than my friend Steven. And what Frank Ocean said is, I'm going to go give this record label a couple really bad albums just to get out of the deal, right? And so you'll see artists do that as well.
That was actually one of my first thoughts. Like, can you just go and put out like 2 really shitty albums and then just like move on?
You'll have artists that will do that. Now, it requires a slightly different structured contract because in many cases the label will say when you produce the album. But if the label just says just give us 3 albums and then you're done, an artist could theoretically give you 3 really bad albums and then squeeze out of the deal. So that's a huge aspect of the industry. Now, you had asked, what happens, Kyle, with the advent of SoundCloud, TikTok, et cetera. It does start to change things a little bit. It doesn't change things a lot, though. What it ultimately does is it gives more exposure for artists to get screwed over by record labels again. So it makes the A&R process, which is artist and repertoire, or basically artist research process. So there's people within labels, and their job is basically to go out to small shows, check out SoundCloud, et cetera, and find the next up and coming thing, right? So, Scooter Braun found found Justin Bieber and Ariana Grande, et cetera. This guy has kicked butt. And basically what he did for years is he just went and tried to find, rising talent on the internet or in local bars and so forth. So there's a path that you can take as an artist to get a lot of exposure with a TikTok or a SoundCloud or whatever, since playing in a bar doesn't give you the exposure that those do. And you may get picked up off of those. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to get screwed when you get picked up off those. They're still going to come to you and say, hey, we love what you're doing. We'll give you a deal for a single, and then we're never going to pick you up again, or we're going to do a 360 deal. The one thing that has changed is, number one, artists are more aware of how the industry will hurt them. And number two, what a lot of artists have now is leverage. And leverage is everything in life, as I'm sure you know, Will, as the CEO of a company. Leverage is everything. So there's a great story of an artist named Russ, R-U-S-S, if you've heard of him. He was kind of a rising hip-hop talent from a couple of years ago. And he was one of the first people on SoundCloud to basically build his entire collection of music and release it all for free on SoundCloud. He did, hundreds and hundreds of tracks that at the time had, and I'm sure they still do, had millions and millions and millions and millions of listens. So he had just an enormous repertoire of music and a ton of leverage. So Columbia, interestingly enough, who I was working with, approached him and said, hey, we're interested, and we want to do a 360 deal with you. And Russ said, absolutely not. I don't need Columbia because I already have a massive distribution channel. I'm already making money off my independent channels. Columbia would be nice to have because I know you have exclusive relationships with, certain radio stations, certain distributors, certain concert venues. So there is value, but I need to structure something that benefits me. And Russ was one of the first people in our industry that received a legitimately equitable contract that was almost a 50-50 deal with Columbia to say, hey, Columbia, you'll pick me up, but I'm not going to do a 360 deal where you'd have all control over me. We're just going to split this. We're going to split my entity essentially in half between us for a certain amount of albums. And he did that. And he is highly, highly, highly successful now. So you see kind of a mixed bag in terms of how this all ends up working out. I will say that obviously YouTube, Apple Music, Spotify, SoundCloud, all of these independent platforms have definitely changed the game for artists. But just because you can independently release music doesn't mean that you can necessarily independently distribute that music as wide as you may need to go. And what's fascinating to me, Will, and this is one of the things I learned in the promotion space, is that you would think, hey, I'm an independent artist. I put myself out on Spotify, I advertise on Instagram, et cetera. I'm going to be successful. Fascinatingly enough, that's not the majority of the way that people consume any real form of content. So it was mind-blowing to me personally that there are still hundreds of millions of people in the US that listen to the radio every day, right? You would think that the radio is a completely antiquated thing, but you go to the middle of Arkansas and you get and drive a truck from the 90s, like they don't have Bluetooth, they're not listening to Spotify, they're probably turning on whatever their local station is. And so it's not that the labels are out of the picture just yet. They'll still probably be around, but the difference is, like I had mentioned, is that artists are more savvy, they have more leverage, and for the first time, in my opinion, at least in my journey in the industry, is that you have artists who recognize the importance of, partnering up with a business person from the get-go, right? So they're bringing on attorneys, managers, et cetera, before they even talk to a label, which is just so incredibly critical. You add those pieces in, you get a more equitable relationship, but not to the satisfaction of the label. They'd be totally fine with doing 360 deals all day.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because so the 360 deal and then the single, you mentioned both of those. Are there any other types? Well, maybe actually, if you could start with how the single structure works, because we went into the 360, but I'd be curious how the single, is that the right terminology, by the way? Okay. And then are there any other kind of deals that are more common that you see in the industry? Or just
you'll get
mainly those two?
It's a great question. I mean, you'll get a little bit of everything. You'll get artists who say, "Hey, I'm starting, Saz Mining Music LLC. I'm gonna give 25% to Columbia and 75% to me." Doesn't really happen like that because the labels are typically going to want more. They're sort of like an investor in your project. That's how you have to think about it. So they're coming.
That's what it
saying,
sounds like hearing you talk through it. It really seems like an interesting type of like entrepreneur to like VC type of relationship almost.
It's very, very much like that, right? So the idea is basically that they're going to be sort of like strategic capital, where they're going to come in and they're going to say, we're not just going to give you money, but we're also going to give you, music video producers, distribution channels. We're going to give you producers. We're going to give you strategic consultants for the way you structure your brand. Like it's a lot more than just here's money. And because of that, the labels feel like they deserve more. So you'll very rarely see like an equity split. That's super favorable towards the artist. If the best that you'll see is probably like a 50-50 with the label, but in most cases it's more like artist keeps 30, artist keeps 40%. And then you also have to remember when the artist gets their payout, you hear like, oh wow, Beyonce did a show for $1 million or something like that. Now Beyonce is a very, very she's an extreme edge case in this example, but the bottom line is that $1 million is not going directly to her. There's a lot of payments that have to go out along the way before the money hits your bank account, and that's typically how you'll see deals structured. So if it's a 50-50 deal, it's not a 50-50 deal with the artist; it's with their entity that has all of these different components to it. So you'll see that. You'll also see the 360 album deals, like I mentioned, where it'll be a certain amount of albums, then you're released. You'll also see non-360 album deals where it's, hey, we're going to do 3 albums together. We're both going to commit to this. You can't release anything else during this time, but we're not taking away your full creative freedom, right? You'll see also, you'll very rarely see just pure singles that are released. Singles almost are always tied to an album, right? But they're kind of a proof of concept for an album. So you'll take like Lil Nas X, he had a massive single a couple of years ago with Old Town Road with I think it was Billy Ray Cyrus that he released that with, and that was a proof of concept for an album, right? So the idea was the label says, hey, we think this song's going to hit, right? We're going to bring in country and rap for the first time. If this works well, we'll have a contingent album deal that's tied to it, and there's certain metrics that you have to hit. So it's almost like a performance-based incentive for an artist. So I mean, it's funny, like, people look at the entertainment industry from the outside, and me of being someone that grew up 20 minutes from Hollywood, I always was looking at it from the outside, even though I was right next door to it. And you think that that there's so many smoke and mirrors when you look at it from a distance, but in reality, it operates just like any other business. The only difference is that your product are people. So instead of you and I, kicking out power and internet services for miners, right? Well, these people are basically just putting out artists, right? And so the artist is the product, the artist is a person though, and with people come a lot more problems. And that's ultimately where you get to all this craziness that I'm referring to.
Yeah. So one final question on this, and then we can start moving into the more crypto, Bitcoin focused conversation.
I enjoy this.
This is like
we talk about mining
very
enough,
selfish
right?
on. Yeah, like I just like have been so curious about this. And after seeing that was your background, it's like I have to dive into this with you.
Yeah. What's even weirder is how I went from music to mining, which I might be the only person that's done that.
Yeah, you might be the only one to do that for quite some time, but you're the only one I know, at least, after all these conversations with miners. So if you had to share one thing that you find interesting about the industry that we have not yet covered before taking a step back and going on to the mining side, what is one thing that you can leave me and the rest of the listeners with before we put this topic to bed?
In regards to the music industry?
In regards to the music industry, yeah. And one final piece that might be interesting as well is if you have any predictions for the future, just because I know that it's evolved so much over, like you mentioned, it's like the tech industry. There's just so many new technologies. People are leveraging them in different ways. You have a different market dynamic once these new technologies come in. So from your point of view and your background, I'm curious if there's anything that you can share there.
It's an awesome question, Will. It really is an awesome question because, as you can probably tell from the earlier phase of this conversation, a lot of the ways that I approach life is philosophical and then philanthropic, right? So I look at it from both perspectives. And when it comes to the music industry, I really, really strongly believe that the what will ultimately carry the torch of the light of humanity will be creatives, because a lot of the non-creative components of humans will end up in the hands of AI, right? So no longer is the ability to write a fast email or negotiate well in a sales call really be that valuable to us in 50, 60, 70 years, because a lot of that stuff's going to be taken over. I mean, I went to Chat GPT the other day and said, hey, write me a pitch email. And it was pretty good. It was pretty good.
It's
And so
crazy.
it just goes to show that the ones that will carry the torch of the light of humanity are going to be creatives. And so that's why I always encourage people to tap in their creative brains. But the second piece is, you have to be really focused, if you want humanity's light to be carried, on supporting creatives, and particularly independent creatives. So what I would leave your listeners with is, if you have the opportunity to support an independent creator, remember that you're not just doing it to launch their career, you're actually doing it to carry, again, the light of humanity forward. Creatives don't very rarely receive words of affirmation. They very rarely receive monetary donations as well. But if you get the opportunity to impact a creator's life, I always highly recommend it, because it's such a critical component of our future. And then the second thing, of course, too, is just tap into your own creativity as well. There's so many people that have said to me before, and this is an adage that unfortunately gets repeated throughout our society, which is that I'm not creative. Well, everyone's creative in some way. I am certain of it. And you may not realize it, but creativity can appear in a lot of different forms of your life. It can appear in the way that you write, the way you speak, the way that you cook, the way that you eat, the types of relationships you build. I mean, creativity is not just necessarily consolidated all the way back to just painting and drawing and playing music and et cetera. So tap into your own creativity and support the creativity of others, because it's so incredibly important in carrying, again, forward the torch that is the light of humanity. So that's just so incredibly important to me to share. Now, secondarily, that kind of leans into, what does the future of this world look like, right? And I think the reality is that the entertainment industry as a whole is going to follow the same trends that we're seeing in other industries. They're just going to leverage the technologies that are appearing and being developed in other places. So when you think about things like artificial intelligence, virtual reality, when you think about really more all of that combined together, you see it as immersive experiences. And I feel like that's the future of entertainment in a lot of ways, is how much more immersive can we get? We're already at a stage where we have things like limited forms of virtual reality. We have really immersive movie experiences, with IMAX, for example. Now you go to certain theme parks and they have both those components integrated into them. So I think it's just going to become more and more immersive. And then as it becomes more immersive, it's going to, of course, become more custom and tailored specific to the individual. So now when you go to a theme park of the future, it's going to be, I'm going to put on my VR mask and everything around me is going to be tailored to my likes and desires, right? And so I think that we're going to be entering into an entertainment space that's highly, highly, highly tailored and highly immersive. And we're also going to be entering into an entertainment space that really leverages all of the unique forms of technology that we're going to be stepping into. And so where does the artist fit into all of that? They don't have to do anything. That's what I try to explain to young creatives is don't get too overwhelmed and too caught up in all of the changes. Again, partner up with someone that's familiar with what's happening and that you can leverage their knowledge and experience to be able to expand the reach of your impact. But the problem is, when artists start to mix business with creativity too much, they lose what makes them so special, right? So there's two very separate lanes that need to be followed to push forward, the creativity of humans, and most importantly, support artists long term. And I think, again, it's going to be a mix of finding that really, really delicate balance of business and monetization of your creative output, and also just the creative output itself. I think if you can divide that across two different individuals and allow the creative individual to be creative and the business person to do business, then that is ultimately the perfect marriage that will keep artists going for as long as we hope they can. And then my final note on this is, where does artificial intelligence fit in this picture? And for now, I'm going to hold this opinion on this. And I have a feeling if you bring me back on your podcast, Will, in a year from now, this opinion may change. I have a feeling it will most certainly change in 10 years from now. But at this stage, I do not feel that AI will be a replication for artists. I think there's an argument for it. I think that AI will be able to create a lot of things that we perceive as beautiful, but it will all be recycled. Right. And that's what makes AI so powerful, is that ultimately what it's doing is it's receiving human input to create an output in some form. Will it include lots and lots and lots of human data points and data that it's been fed to produce something? Absolutely. And it will likely be something that we've not seen before, because we're going to be crossing over data points that have never been crossed before. For example, an AI that studies, that has been fed a set of data from an artist in Africa to an artist in California, and you mix those two together and you produce something that seems completely unique and new, when in reality it's just taking human input to produce computer generated output. And so because of that, I still believe strongly in the creators. I still believe strongly in the ingenuity of humans, and what we can create, because ultimately AI is just going to be an extrapolation of our own abilities ultimately. So I will continue to fight for the creator, and that might just be me just trying to fight for the dying light of humanity. But I'm going to try to keep my creative friends and my own creative self as long, here and important as long as I can.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny you mentioned the AI aspect within music. I wasn't even planning on speaking with you about this, but the one note I will say is that
Yeah.
we just created, we're thinking about using it for the intro of the podcast or the outro. And at least initially, we're going to keep the same intro music and then use it on the outro. But I was hanging out with my friend who produces music, and he and I just sitting there were leveraging these AI tools in the music creation process. As I'm talking about, you can probably tell that I don't really make music. This isn't my specialty or anything. I was just sitting there, and he's like playing beats and doing things. And he's asking, do you like this? Do you not like this? And I was just nodding or nodding no. So that's how that song was created.
Wow.
Leveraging AI. But moving on to what I think is you're one of the best people to speak to about this, is not only frontier mining. I know on the previous podcast we spoke about what it is that you guys do, but I'm thinking about blending it to talk about lessons that anyone listening that you can learn from an entrepreneurship perspective, and then blending that in with your story of how you started Frontier. So maybe just, I didn't like really prep you for this or anything, but
that's okay, man.
That's kind of how I want to dive through this, is really talk about, like the ups, the downs, how you overcome tough times in building a company, but also, the story behind Frontier, how you guys started, and then we can dive into what you see the landscape of Bitcoin mining, crypto, all these other topics, how they looked at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a loaded question, as I know you know, man. So we'll break it down. But as I think it's just so incredibly important for me, I always try to dial it back into my why when people ask these questions, because if I did not explain my why, jumping from music all the way over to mining probably would not make sense for the average person when they hear my story. But there's an underlying why that sort of carries this or pulls this all together, and there's ultimately a North Star that I'm being drawn to, and these are just the modalities or the tools that I'm using to reach that North Star, right? So, and that's ultimately kind of my another key philosophy I hold when I'm describing to people what the path is towards reaching your greatest goal in life. It may not look the way that you think it will on a day-to-day basis. On a month-to-month basis, even a year-to-year basis, it may not look like what you think it may look like. My North Star may look totally different than the actions that I take today. But if I can see how the actions I take today connect me back to where I'm going, then it justifies my day-to-day, and it helps me get out of bed in the morning. Right. And so that helps to sort of preface the answer to this question, which is, how do you go all the way from music to mining, and what does the journey of entrepreneurship into the cryptocurrency mining space look like? Because that's been, a wacky, wild, and very circuitous adventure, and has ironically felt a lot like the days of the music space, and then also the startup tech space that I've toyed around in for a long time now. So I'll back up and start with, basically where I ended this last kind of segment of my journey, which was getting to Columbia Records. Right. So I got to Columbia, was really keen to make it into the music industry, and was really excited, frankly, that I had gotten to that point, because it's a hard door to break into. And once I was inside, I'm like, I'm here. And then unfortunately, the call of entrepreneurship started to ring pretty often within the first 6 months of being at Columbia. I was fortunate enough when I was at Chapman University, which is the school I graduated from down in Southern California, that I was really well connected with a lot of smart people at the school, because I was really driven to break some old habits and try to become the best version of myself academically while I was there. So one of the people that I connected with was a guy named Nick, and Nick came from Silicon Valley, which to me at the time was like, whoa, Silicon Valley, what is this place? I mean, it was just totally a place that was held in sparkly lights in my head. So after meeting Nick, he shared with me his story of Silicon Valley, and he grew up around all these great investors and whatnot. And he had mentioned to me that he was working on a project kind of in the startup app tech space, et cetera. And I was intrigued, but, I was doing my thing with Beats Are Better in Columbia, so I didn't feel super called to pursue that until about 3-4 months later, when another friend of mine mentioned that he was also working on a project, and it turned out to be Nick's project, which was at the time an app called Filter. It's not worth getting into all the details of filter right now, but I was really intrigued by it. And I remember what the light that started to turn on in that moment was my two friends came to me and said, "Hey, we're building this app called Filter," and they started describing it to me. And I'll never forget this moment. I came out of a final, and this was, gosh, probably 6-7 years ago now. I came out of a final, I think it was my junior year, and I was sitting outside after they told me about this idea. We finished the final, they tell me about the idea. I sit outside, I open up my notebook, and I probably wrote 3-4 pages of what a consultant would basically do, which was all of these different problems that I saw and how I would solve them. And it totally felt like it was just a download from the universe. I mean, I hadn't never done business consulting before. I feel like I had a natural aptitude for it, but I had never actually just tried to analyze a problem within a business and then solve it. I had my own companies up to that point, but they were not, they were definitely very early stage organizations. They're not super well established, didn't have real processes, accounting, anything like that. So all that being said, pitched this idea, toyed around with it, but said, you know what, I have the music industry that I'm pursuing right now. I'm going to stick with that. Came back after the summer. They said, hey, we're still working on this. And by the way, we have another idea that's kind of spawned out of this, which is ultimately that building this company Filter is really, really hard, right? We've had a lot of challenges with it. And what one of my friends at the time, Austin, shared with me was that, I'm learning through this process of trying to build Filter, and then Kyle building his companies, that companies are really hard to build, right? And that ultimately led us to the big revelation, which was, why don't we just start a company that helps other people build companies? And so it sounded a lot more innovative at the moment. As it turned out, it's a lot harder to execute this wild kind of dream we had. But I then spent a couple of years during the end of my time in college and shortly after college, building a company that I'm proud still runs today called CO. CO is an organization that was designed to basically help startups start up. And we worked with, again, early stage entrepreneurs and sort of help them take their ideas on napkins and turn them into legitimate, full functioning businesses. So I ran that business for a couple of years, started to even more deeply identify the problems that exist in the startup space. And throughout that journey, there were a couple of things that really rang strongly to me, which was that above all, business is just really, really hard, like I shared a second ago. But the second thing is that entrepreneurship is not that fun. I think people paint this picture that entrepreneurship is like all, roses and daisies and butterflies. You're going to have a yacht in 2 years after starting your business and all this. When in reality, entrepreneurship, 98% of it is extremely difficult, and frankly, not something that I would recommend to someone else. It's not like an enjoyable experience by any standard. I mean, it's a lot of late nights. It's a lot of not getting in the gym. It's a lot of eating food that you probably wish you weren't eating. I mean, it's just doing a lot of things that require an enormous amount of sacrifice. And I got to the end of the road with CO and ultimately realized that sacrifice was going to be one that I was willing to take, but willing to take if I was utilizing that energy in what I felt was a really channeled direction. So as I was sort of working my way through CO, this started to creep up into 2016 when we were building that business. And I had felt a calling to move on to my next chapter. And again, take this really focused level of sacrifice and put it towards something that I could see building strongly towards the future. So I knew I wanted to take sacrifice. I just didn't necessarily know where to best channel that energy. And 2016, as you might remember, Will, was an interesting year for the cryptocurrency space. What had happened, that was during the time where we started to see some attention that started to come towards things like Bitcoin and Ethereum. That was when I believe it was Ethereum's initial launch and public sale was right around that time as well. And of course, cryptocurrency leaked into the CO offices too. So we were having conversations about this interesting space. We had a friend that bought Ethereum at like $4 and was making a bunch of money. It was really, really attractive to us. But frankly, we didn't know a ton about it. We were, for the most part, young, struggling entrepreneurs. But it started to insert itself in the back of my head as being a space that was worth toying around with, right? So we did some day trading and learned about the space. And then where things really started to take a shift for me, and it was, again, kind of occurring all at a time where I was ready to use this kind of entrepreneurial sacrifice, but I wanted to make sure it was in a channeled direction. So I had that happening in one corner of my life. I had crypto presenting in another corner. And then in the last corner of my life, I had reconnected with a long time friend, a guy named Arland. You might know Arland as the CEO of Frontier Mining and my business partner. He actually was someone that I had met when I was 6 years old, and he was one of my closeted nerd friends. He was, self-admittedly, a little bit on the nerdier side growing up, all the way back to elementary school. Again, I was more of a closeted nerd, but he was someone that I always really connected with growing up. So he was working in corporate at the time. I was working with CO at the time. I said, hey, through kind of a series of conversations, in very simple terms, there's a lot more to this story. I basically said, hey, do you want to get out of corporate and come work for us for less money? And he said, sure. So he came down as our director of technology at CO, and him and I start working together and re-collaborating after several years of not seeing each other. And one of the strangest things happened. We had brought him on to CO. He always worked in a separate office in our incubator, and he was always on phone calls. And I'm like, well, I didn't put you on any phone calls today, Arlen. Like, what are you doing? Well, as it turned out, him and his dad were starting to ideate about the mining space very, very early. But one of the questions he had for me while we were in this office space was, and this was really ultimately how my journey into mining space began. He said, hey, do you guys pay for power here? And that's the $1 million or million cents per kilowatt hour question. He said, you pay for power in this incubator. And I said, no, this was actually it was our college incubator. We had graduated. They still gave us office space. We didn't pay for anything. And he said, cool, let me bring something down and show you what I've been working on. And this is prior to me knowing him doing anything with mining. So we're all obsessed about crypto. He comes down to the office with a GPU rig that he had built because he'd been toying around some Reddit forums and saw how to mine Ethereum with a couple of GPUs that he had for a video game system in his house. Brings it down to our office. We had 2 offices. One of them was a storage closet where we put interns in, basically a storage closet. And we set up a miner in there. We turned the air conditioning down to 60 degrees. The room was still 95 during the day. The interns were sweating. It was kind of an interesting scene. It was really, really funny. But right there and then, we started to create cryptocurrency in our office out of a computer that was built on PVC pipes. So the whole thing was just this kind of series of inputs that were happening in my life. I had Arlen, who was on our team, but he was starting to toy around with the cryptocurrency mining space. I was really intrigued by the crypto space. He brings a miner down to the office. And during this time, I'm feeling a calling for my next direction. So it's this kind of mix of events that happened in my life. And then I had looked at my other co-founders as CEO one day and really felt like we were maybe not as aligned on our future as we could be. And that's when Arlen ultimately came to me and said, hey, that cryptocurrency miner that I brought down to the office and all those calls that I've been on, well, my dad and I have been talking about, possibly transitioning into this space because his dad comes from 30 years in the data center world, right? And he said, we've got a kind of really early stages of an idea. We've got these shipping containers that we can plug these machines into. And I honestly, it was all Chinese to me back in 2016. I didn't know. And for the Chinese speakers out there, I'll reference and say I don't know Chinese. So it felt like a foreign language to me. And so he was sharing this all with me. And I frankly told him, like, I don't think I'm ready for that level of risk again. Now I'm walking into the cryptocurrency space, which is incredibly volatile. It had very low market cap at the time. I don't think I'm ready to take that much risk. So I pushed that idea away. We worked on CO, and to speed up the story to ultimately where the journey to mining formally began, him and I continue to have a conversation about it. He keeps working on CO, and then a couple months later, I decide that it's time for me to move on to my, the next journey in my career. So I go straight to Silicon Valley, which I was always intrigued by. I started interviewing for positions at Square and Google and Facebook and all these great companies that were really illustrious in my head. But the whole time through, Arlen kept mentioning to me, kept texting me on the side, hey, do you want to come, chat with me and my dad about what we're up to? We really want to launch this, but I need a partner on this project ultimately. And I just, again, was just so turned off to the startup world after doing several years of working several late nights with my prior organization that I founded. And finally, one day I sat down with Arlen and his dad, and I said, look, guys, I am intrigued by what you guys are doing, but I really feel called to work corporate. And his dad, being the great negotiator that he is, who had known me since I was a kid, says, Kyle, look, you have 2 options here. One option is that you can go have someone else tell you what to do, or second option, you can tell yourself what to do. What sounds better? And I said, well, when you put it like that, and right there,
you could see the entrepreneur in you, and just had to push that last domino over.
That's exactly right, man. So right there and then, I kind of had a moment that was very pivotal in my life. And I look back at that lifeline I was referencing earlier, and I looked at Arlen and said, all right, my friend of 20 plus years at that time, which was strange to say as a young 20-year-old. I said, all right, Arlen, my friend of 20 plus years, shook his hand, said, let's get to business, man. And that's ultimately what led to the founding of Frontier. So his dad moved into more of an advisory role. Arlen and I kind of joined forces, and we started building this company. There's so many layers to what happens after that story that I'm sure that there are more questions to be shared. But that was ultimately what kind of kicked off the beginning of this mining journey for me.
Yeah, that's great. So I think that's a really good place to, pause. And I want to talk through a couple of things that you mentioned there. So the first one,
sure.
When do you know if it's the right time to start a company is one of these concepts that I want to unpack with you. And so early on, and people who've listened to my podcast before, I know that I've said this at some point in time, but early on when I was in, my first 4 years as an entrepreneur, whenever someone would come to me with an idea or they really thought they had something that could become a business, and they were thinking about maybe doing something. It was in that idea stage. They were by no means going to be taking the jump. I would always be that friend that would say, hey, you got this, man. This can work. You can do it.
Yeah.
You should go give it a shot. And then after being an entrepreneur for a longer and longer period of time, you really see the reality of what being an entrepreneur is like, especially if you know who your friend is and you just know that they're not, it's not saying one path is right or wrong, but they're not just not the person who's going to want to work, 80+ hour weeks on end, or they're not going to want, if they're the type of friend that's saying, oh, I want to start a business so I can make a lot of money so I don't have to work anymore, then that's probably not the path that they should go down. Being an entrepreneur is very difficult. You're going to run into challenges. You're going to run into a lot of challenges that you don't know the answers to, and you're going to have to go find the answers. And there's not just a teacher or a textbook or an answer at the end that you can just go and skip to. You're going to have to go roll with the punches, take them. And sometimes the right decision will be one thing, and the exact same scenario that it could be the wrong thing. It's kind of like poker, right? You can make the best play in poker and lose the hand. You can also make the wrong play in poker and end up winning the hand. And you just got to hope that if you're there, you're showing up day by day. Yeah. You're going to end up making a winning play over the long run, and you got to stick with it. And so from your perspective as an entrepreneur, when you're going through that journey and you're going through those tough times, because inevitably it's going to happen. There's going to be, like the poker analogy, you're just going to take a bunch of bad beats. You should be winning. You're doing the right thing. You're showing up, but things just aren't going your way. For even someone who's meditating every day, it's great to hear that you do it. I feel like that's a very common trait among entrepreneurs. It's a habit that helps because it helps you put things in perspective. It helps you get your thoughts in order, and it just helps you become more emotionally resilient, because you have to be if you're going to be an entrepreneur. Outside of the meditation piece, are there any type of mindsets or any type of tricks or any type of philosophies that you hold that have helped you within your entrepreneurial journey?
It's a great question. Well, it's a great question. And, I equate the entrepreneurial journey a lot to the journey of life, right? So I think the concept of an entrepreneur has been sort of misdefined over time, because a lot of people perceive it as, the conventional definition is an entrepreneur is someone that's willing to take financial risk, right? That's the predominant core of it to achieve a certain goal, vision, idea, et cetera. And while I think that is true, and I think that financial risk is a component of it, ultimately, I've always boiled entrepreneurship down to entrepreneurship is a mindset, right? It's a mindset of innovativeness, independence, and an ultimate goal to impact somewhere in your world, right? It typically starts with an entrepreneur and making a change in their world, and then making a change in their community's world, and then making a change in the world, right? But it ultimately starts with the problem that you see in your space that you want to make a difference on, and you want to impact to some degree. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, you ask what modalities, methodologies that I utilize to continue to keep me sane during this, like I said, very circuitous, very, very wacky journey. I think the first one, like I shared, is the mindset component. You have to have a mindset of, ultimately, again, independence, innovation, and impact. I'm a really strong believer in that. Number two, I really believe at your core, you need to be able to have a North Star that you can connect your day-to-day actions to, like I was sharing earlier. So if you don't have a why that's really driving you, if you don't have a North Star that, again, you can relate everything you do to, you're eventually going to run out of gas, not because you run out of energy, but because you run out of purpose, right? And so I'm a big believer that every action you take, I need to be able to go to you, Will, and say, as a CEO of a business, and say, Will, that email that you're writing right now, tell me why you're doing that. The first thing you'll say is, well, Kyle, I'm doing this because I want to make sure I get back to the client on time. I say, well, why do you want to get back to the client on time? And you say, well, because I want to show them I'm responsive. Why do you want to show them responsive? Well, I'm trying to earn this deal. Why do you want to earn the deal? Well, I want to get the deal because my company needs to make 100K in the next 6 months to stay alive. Okay, so why do you want to keep your company alive? And then you can see how those questions start to spiral out further. I want to keep the company alive so I can pay my employees. Well, why do you want the company in the first place? Well, I want to achieve independence for myself and be able to build generational wealth for my kids. Why do you want to build generational wealth for your kids? And you can see how every action that you take relates to a much greater purpose in your life. So you're not just writing that email, Will, because you want to get back to someone on time. You're writing it because you're trying to impact 10 generations down the Saz mining lineage, if you will, right? I only say Saz mining because I can't pronounce your last name, but I think you get what I'm going for there. And so my point is that as an entrepreneur, it's just so incredibly critical to be able to connect your actions back to your purpose. Otherwise, you'll run out of motivation for your actions, right? So like I said, mindset is a really important component to me. The second component that I think is just absolutely critical is what I kind of slightly hinted on earlier, but it's just what your appetite for loss is. Now, I think people typically say in entrepreneurship, it's your appetite for risk, right? So how much risk am I willing to take? But what I've learned in entrepreneurship is part of this appetite for risk, but it's more so how comfortable you are with loss. The reality is that everything you do in life is going to have a component of risk to it. So we all have the ability to take on risk. The question is, how much loss are we willing to take on? Because the entrepreneurial journey is majority of it you're losing, right? I know a lot of people that come to the entrepreneurial space from a path of winning, like a lot of former athlete friends of mine who were state champions and whatnot. They came to the entrepreneurship space and they lost every single opportunity they had for the first year or two of their business. As we know, most businesses aren't going to become cash flow positive for 3 years in some cases. It's a really, really long journey of mostly eating crap, right? It's not fun. It's a lot of pain. It's a lot of suffering. It's a lot of sacrifice. So it's what your appetite for loss is. And if you're okay losing, if you're okay looking yourself in the mirror and saying, I am a loser today, then I believe that you're on the right path towards winning. But it starts with losing a lot. And then I think the last piece, of course, is, and this is something that you hinted on a bit earlier as well, but it's ultimately those mindful practices that you carry into your day to day, right? I believe it's just so incredibly critical to be able to recenter yourself and bring yourself back to a place of balance. And the reason that I find that those activities are so important, and I take so many of them into my daily practices in terms of gratitude, intention setting, and really just and really just ultimately like coming back to a place where you can reconnect back to your North Star. So we might have the North Star that drives us initially, but what reconnects us back to it on a day-to-day basis? How do we remind ourselves that what we're doing has a reason behind it, right? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs end up spending a lot of their days in the day-to-day of their business, right? Or in the month-to-month, or the year-to-year. But what about the decade-to-decade, right? Or what about just the second to second? What about taking a step back and just saying, look how awesome this thing is that I've built. Look how awesome it is what I get to do every day. Look how amazing of an impact I'm having on people's lives. If we don't take that time to just pause and reflect and appreciate, then again, like that entrepreneurial fire will get dampered further and further over time to a point where it's going to break. And when you talk to a lot of people about what are the components of burnout, the components of burnout are very, very, very rarely that you run out of energy, because most entrepreneurs have enough energy. They'll work 18, 20 hours a day. It's when you ultimately run out of purpose. And how do you run out of purpose? Well, you run out of purpose by not having enough time to reflect and appreciate everything that you've done, or maybe not having the North Star in the first place. Hence why mindset, risk, and reflection, I think, are ultimately the makeup of an entrepreneur. If you can have those components and you can integrate them into your daily practices, not just let's do a quarterly review, but every single day doing a review of how strong you're progressing towards your North Star, that's how you ultimately become great. But if you forget just one of those, you'll eventually spin out. And it might take you a while, but eventually you will reach a point where you will not achieve your goals because you just didn't enjoy the moments along the way.
One of the things that I want to get to with this next question here is just an actionable list of things that you think that people can do to really,
Sure.
Even if they're an entrepreneur or not an entrepreneur, start implementing to, improve their lives, improve their work, improve their energy, be happier overall. And you've mentioned some great things that I think that once we put actionable steps behind them, it's going to be incredible. But the one thing before we dive into that I want to touch on, and that listening to you, it reminded me of, was I believe it was Jordan Peterson that talked about this. And when you're talking about having this North Star that you're going towards, it really does make a huge difference if you just have taken the time to reflect, to know where you're going. And the analogy that comes to mind when I think about this is, let's say that you want to go to the grocery store to buy groceries, right? If you're in a place that you've never been, then you're really going to want to know that you're going to the grocery store. For example, if you have the goal of buying food, right? If you don't have that vision in your mind, you're just going to be driving in circles. If you're not aiming at something, you're just mindlessly wandering about. Versus if you know that where you want to go, even if you're not taking the most direct path there, you're getting closer and closer. You're noticing things. Your reticular activation system is going to at least try and guide you in that direction. And if you do that over a prolonged period of time, you look back 20 years in the future and you're way closer to whatever it is that you're aiming at. You're way closer to that North Star than someone who was just going through the motions, just hoping that luck would put them there. Having that intention is going to create luck. It's going to create opportunities. It's going to push you closer. And your path could be up, down, up, down. You could be further away after 6 months of work than you were, the 6 months prior, but
Hmm.
before you know it, things will start going your way and you'll get closer and closer to that North Star. And,
Yep.
many times you talk with people and you ask, like, what are some of your goals? What are you hoping to accomplish? What's your purpose? What's driving you? What do you want to happen? And they don't know the answers to these questions. It's like, how are you going to end up where you're trying to go if you don't have a goal in mind? And so,
Yep.
going back to the question of like actionable things, takeaways that people can do, I've heard
Yeah.
you mention things around journaling, gratitude, intention. And then on the fitness side, I think that that's huge.
Yeah.
You need to have the energy. Uh, if you don't have the energy, then you're not going to be able to really build a big company at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the thing of just understanding your body. If you know that you're really, really good at these hours of the day, then you probably want to do the most important things that are most pertinent to your why, most pertinent to your goals during those hours, because it's going to make you more efficient overall. So with
Yep.
that, I will pause and I will give the floor to you and let you take it in any way that you want to help people, really not only take what it is that we're saying here in this conversation, but then start putting things into practice.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the big missing component of a lot of the people out there that inspire us to make change is that they'll tell us to get off the couch, but when we're off the couch, what do we do next, right? And I think that's the missing component of frankly a lot of leaders in the world and a lot of these hype men of the internet, is that they're really, really good at giving you that initial jolt, but then you end up getting stuck right after you get up. And I think ultimately this is going to reverberate heavily with what I've been sharing throughout this conversation. And if you see me looking over here, it's only because I wanted to take a few notes. But I think ultimately the first tactical practice that an entrepreneur, or really any person, because again, I don't like the term entrepreneurship because it feels exclusive, when in reality, everyone's an entrepreneur. We're an entrepreneur in our day-to-day lives every single day. Entrepreneurship is about independence and innovation. And impact. It's not necessarily just about I started a business and I'm a CEO. There's so much more to what entrepreneurship is than that, and that's why that term should be stretched more to humanity as a whole. But all that to be said, whether you're a person or whether you believe you're an entrepreneur, whoever you might be, the first tactical practice I take into place is every single action I take, I measure it through three different filters: my why, my how, and my what. Right. And it's a really simple tool that you can utilize to ensure that you're always reconnecting back to your greater purpose. Right. So I like to start with my why. And this is all a part of a greater methodology I use for reverse engineering goals. And I'll speak more to that in a moment. But my why, my how, and my what, super easy tool. So I'm about to make a big decision in my life, right? I put out a spreadsheet and I literally have a column that says why, how, and what. And if I can answer all of those questions strongly and connect them back to each other, I know it's a goal that I should be pursuing in my life. So my why is should theoretically be the easiest to answer if I'm doing something that comes from a place of truth. And that's pretty simple. It's what is your driving motivation? What is your reason? What is your purpose behind this action? What is your intention? And as I've been sharing throughout this conversation, I believe it's so important for people, entrepreneurs, businessmen, and beyond. Everything you do should have intention behind it. Everything you do should have a sense of consciousness to it. So your why, it should be the easiest, right? And that should come from that should come from your heart, ultimately. Your how is when we start talking a little bit more tactically, right? So let's take that why and let's actually shape it into how will I do this, right? So what will be the process that I take to achieve whatever this why is driving me towards, right? And we don't need to necessarily get into the actual, I'm going to send this email at this time to this client to close this deal. No. Let's just think more practically or more holistically speaking, how I'm going to bring this why into action. And then lastly, the what is what am I going to produce? And the problem that ends up happening a lot of the times is that people start with their what and then they bring it back to their how and their why. And the problem with that process is that your what may not be driven from your why. So if you're starting with your what, that may not appear in your life for a purpose-driven reason. Your what may just be, for example, again, I want to send this email out to this client fast, right? So that's my what. That's my tactical action I'm taking. But again, if I'm doing that every single day, Will, which I do, and I'm sure you do too, send lots and lots of emails and messages out, right? It gets really tiresome at a point, right? You get to a point where you're like, man, I'm just typing the same thing over and over again. My fingers hurt. I don't have feeling in my left hand. All these different things start to happen. And it's like, you'll ultimately get to a point. It won't happen in stage one of your entrepreneurial journey. It'll happen after 5 years of running a business like where I'm at now, and very similar to where Saz Mining is at too. And you ultimately have to pause for a second, step back and say, why am I writing this email in the first place? Right. So again, instead of starting with, I'm going to write the email, let's pause and ask ourselves, why am I writing the email? How am I going to respond to that email? And then what am I going to actually send? Right. So why, how, what. I always take those three steps into every decision, from something as big and and grandiose as starting a business or bringing an ideal to life, all the way to a phone call, an email, a text message, or even bringing it in my personal life. Why am I going to bed at 9 p.m. and waking up at 5? What does that actually do for me, right? And it's not about the what being I'm going to sleep from 9 to 5. It's about why am I sleeping from 9 to 5, right? What is this ultimately doing to push me closer to my greater goals and visions in my life? So why, how, what is really, really critical to me. And I think it ultimately all leans into the process of goal creation, right? And I think one of the most challenging parts of goal creation is that we typically are going to start with the beginning of the goal, right? Versus the end, right? So a lot of people, when they say, I have this goal, it's like, all right, what am I going to do today, right? I want to get slim. I'm going to go on a 10-minute walk today, right? And I'm going to go on a 10-minute walk tomorrow, and I'm going to go on a 10-minute walk the next day, and I'm going to start losing weight. But let's back up for a second and let's start with, where do I want to be in 5 years? Right? Like, what does that ideal scenario look for me? I want to have a six pack. I want to have mental clarity. I want to have great relationships with my family. Let's start with where I want to end up, and let's work our way back to that and start dialing that back in. For me, the way that I typically do it is I bring things back. It depends how far out my goal might be, but if we're just using a 5-year goal, I bring back, what do I need to achieve each year leading up to that 5-year goal to get to that point? And then what do I have to do each month of that year to get to that point? And then what do I do at each day to build up to that month? Now, when you're drawing out that entire plan, it can seem, like I said, really grandiose, really complex, and frankly, really cumbersome to work through that entire activity. Most people just want to get to business right away, but there's a reason that we do this. And I think the most important reason above all is so that we can connect our day-to-day actions back to our greater vision. Otherwise, the day-to-day gets really mundane, and eventually you'll start to veer off your path. So I'm always big on reverse engineering goals. Start with where you want to go, not with where you need to be today. And then you'll see, like I said, number one, every action you take will have greater intention behind it. But more importantly, when you're having that off day, it's a lot easier to turn that off day into an on day when you know that you're connected back to something that means a lot more to you than whatever the action is that you're taking today, right? Again, I want to achieve mental clarity all the way back to, I'm going to go to bed at 9 p.m. tonight. But man, I'm going to miss watching that TV show. I'm going to miss having that extra glass of wine. Or I'm going to miss whatever. But it's a lot easier to justify my losses when I know what my upside looks like. So to me, that's just incredibly critical when it comes to forming greater visions and goals in your life, is to start at the end and work yourself back to the beginning. But I think you also have to ask yourself, and this is another sort of tactical approach that I take. So I really believe strongly in the why, how, and what. I really believe strongly in reverse goal engineering. But ultimately, you have to, it's again about like, what makes me feel the most whole in my life, right? So when I'm thinking about what's going to push me along this path, so I might have developed this great vision, right? I might have started with my overall goal. I might have explained my why, my how, and my what to get there. But the other question becomes, like, when I'm not necessarily at my best, when I'm not my strongest that day, when I feel callings towards vices and sins and so forth, like, how do I keep myself going? And one of the things that I think people miss more than anything in the journey of entrepreneurship is they very rarely take time to look outside themselves, right? So we spend so much time thinking about what I just described, the why, the how, the what, the reverse goal engineering, all these different tactical steps I've taken on a day-to-day basis to achieve that goal. But burnout is a very real thing. And burnout typically starts with what I always have described as getting away from my mom's advice, which is that, Kyle, eat your 3 square meals, take a walk in between meetings, call a friend every day. Take simple steps to remind yourself of the purity of life on a day-to-day basis. Those things will fuel you more than you would ever believe. There's so much research that's behind this now, so it's less about me just pontificating about it, that says, hey, it's actually, if you get up every morning and expose yourself to 10 minutes of sunlight in the morning, you will increase your energy levels by 25 to 30% for the entire day. It's like, but Kyle, I want to get up and go straight to work. Let's take one step outside of ourselves. And outside of this kind of really narrowly focused vision that we have, let's just try it. Let's just take one step outside of what this narrowly focused vision is, and let's see if we can contribute back into that bucket. So little steps, little actions that you can take. And I think it's Dr. Andrew Huberstein, if I remember his name correctly, has a long list on how critical it is to take these really body focused tactical steps in your day to day. So a couple of the ones that I've integrated. So number one, the biggest one is I always have, and this gets back into the ultimate kind of fitness goals that I've taken in my life and the approaches. But number one is that I always stay overly hydrated, right? So the first thing I do when I wake up every morning is I consume at least 8 to 12 ounces of water right by my bedside. I don't even think about it, right? So that's step number one. Number two, I always recommend people getting their vitamins in the morning because your body loves to work on an empty stomach. So for me, I'm a big fan of athletic greens. That'd be a legit tactical item that someone could take right now. It's got the majority of your micronutrients in it. It's really easy to consume. It's just a green drink that you spin up every morning. There's lots of other little things I do. I'm big on these. I'm big on superfoods. We've got all sorts of superfoods that exist in our house that we take in the morning. But right after I start my day with a big glass of water and then getting my initial nutrients in for the day on an empty stomach, and then going outside as fast as I can. Right. Number one, I want natural light to pour in my eyes. So I'm not going out. I typically will go out with a shirt on. I'll typically go out in my boxers if I can, let my body soak in as much vitamin D as possible, because the sun is our source of all energy. It's the source of everything's energy. The problem is, Will, we spend so much time in an office having light filtered in by glass, or in some cases with no light at all, that it's not a surprise that people are feeling really energy deficient because they're not pulling energy from the strongest source that we have. So I always go and want to expose myself to 10 to 15 minutes of sunlight in the morning. I want to get directly into my eyes. You will notice a dramatic uptick in your energy by doing that. It's really mind blowing. And then the next thing that I do right after that is some form of movement. Again, challenge with entrepreneurs is we spend a lot of times behind our desk. A lot of us, unfortunately, are sitting behind our desk most of the time. Some of us are standing, but the bottom line, we're not moving our body. And blood flow is so incredibly critical to basically everything that we do, whether it be negotiating a call, coming up with a great idea, and so forth. If we want our brains to work at top speed, we have to have some sort of movement. And again, a lot of entrepreneurs, it's a very typical response when I mention the importance of movement to them, which is that I don't have enough time. Well, you always have enough time for a 10 to 20 minute walk. And if that walk has to be used to take your sales call for the day or to get your calendar set up for the morning, it's great because your phone is 6 inches long and fit in your pocket. So there's not really an excuse for me to not get movement in. It's been, again, scientifically proven over and over again that our brain works better when we're moving, because biologically, that's how we've been created. Every single ancestor of humans was constantly moving and was at its sharpest when it was moving. So if you think about Homo sapiens all the way back to monkeys and so forth, their sharpest brain was when they were out in the wild protecting their family, constantly moving, right? So it's all about movement to inspire brain activity, and more importantly, to open up different portals of your mind that you may have not been able to access. And I think that's the most important component of movement. But a lot of people will also say, well, Kyle, it's also great to move. So we like to shake up the lactic acid. We like to keep our body in a really strong physical condition as well. And I totally agree with that all. But for me, I've just always equated movement back to mind. I think I understand the correlation between movement and body. And I think that's a nice benefit of it. But if you want to be sharp as an entrepreneur, you can't not move. So all that ultimately shapes around, I think there are some really grandiose steps that we can take to forming great goals and visions and achieving the things that we want in our life. But it ultimately comes down to the day to day. And there's 2 times of the day that I feel like are strongest to set ourselves up and close ourselves down on whatever rhythm that your body operates on. It's that first kind of start to your day. So getting right out of bed, water, nutrients, sunlight, movement. It's a simple combination. It doesn't take that much work. And then right after that, diving into deep work and then moving on to phone calls. That's typically the flow that I recommend taking for entrepreneurs, because catch your brain when it's fresh, right up that initial 20-minute walk in the morning. And then the last piece is the close down of the day. And I believe that the middle of the day is when you're operating off of your highs, and your close down for the day is when you're recharging for what's to come. Unfortunately, like I shared earlier in the chat, Will, humans are extremely inefficient. We need a lot of time to wind up and a lot of time to slow down. So when it comes to, this is my last tactical step when it comes to body, there's lots of other things we can do, but a big one for me is the close down of the day. So I always recommend entrepreneurs, hustlers of all shapes and sizes. This is one that when I say it, a lot of people give me a lot of flack for it, but I recommend that you wrap your day up at least 4 hours before you're actually going to bed. Right. And I think it's a big mistake when entrepreneurs go right from their desk to sleep, because the bottom line, the quality of your sleep is not going to be strong. Number 2, you're missing out on a lot of what you can capture in the evening. So what I do in the evenings is a very specific set of steps, but I try to always wrap my work up at least 4 hours before bed. And then I go straight to food, and then I go straight to movement again. The reason I take those steps is because you want at least 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed to complete your last meal. It's critical. It by a long shot is going to increase health, increase weight loss, and increase the quality of your sleep. So I go typically straight from desk to food, and then I move on to some form of movement again. Now, I'll get my workouts in either in the morning during my movement period or during the evening. I usually will try to do it in the morning because the days get long. But all that being said, I'll go straight to food, then straight to movement again because I want to give myself an opportunity to digest. And then I go straight into kind of a red light environment that I set up in my home. So easy to get LED strips and set this up, but it helps to naturally adjust your body to sleep. So you almost want like a kind of a sunset color in your home, like a kind of a red orange. That's going to start to increase your melatonin production prior to sleep. And then I try to use that time window there, which is, in a perfect world, that's from like 8 to 10 p.m. I'm increasing melatonin production. I'm slowing down brain cycles. I'm staying away from blue light and ideally away from my phone as much as possible. And then I'm shifting over to some sort of ingestion of creativity or knowledge. And that can come in a couple different forms, but that's when your brain really wants it at those hours of the night, I've found, because in the morning, you're typically ramping up and you're ready to go take on really deep work, high intensity projects. In the evening, that's a great opportunity for knowledge consumption. So I'll use that time for reading, painting, journaling, etc. Just something that scratches the other itch that I haven't been able to work on throughout the day. It's also a really nice way to go to sleep because for me, what I've found is that if I go with I guess the best way to describe it is low intensity, high value knowledge consumption right before bed, my brain will then use all that data and it will solve problems for me throughout the night. And then I'll wake up in the morning. And when I do my 20, 30-minute walk in the morning, all these downloads come from when I slept, right? And I said, oh, wow, I just solved 5 or 6 problems that are going to make my day run 10 times more efficiently because I gave my brain time to work on problems throughout the evening by doing a low intensity, high knowledge consumption activity right before bed. And then, of course, there's lots of other things that I can plug in, but that's an easy set of steps that anybody can take. Start your day off really, really slowly with movement, end your day really, really slowly with knowledge consumption. I think you'll find that you'll be much more balanced as a person and a lot more effective in your business as well.
I think you absolutely nailed it when you said, humans were very inefficient creatures. And it's one of those things where there's so many different little things that you can do throughout the day. Hearing you talk, it's funny because, we haven't talked about this before. But we somehow have landed on so many similar activities and patterns and habits. Outside of the meditation, I'm the exact same way. I drink a ridiculous amount of water. I actually am it's kind of weird because I feel like because I drink so much fluids, I have to go to the bathroom more than other people. But it does make a huge difference. Like my new baseline is completely different because I drink so much water. And same thing, first thing when I wake up, I'm just chugging water. And you mentioned it, Aaron Huberman, I think is his name. I hope I'm not butchering it.
I said Huberstein or something, so we're both off. It's Andrew Huberman. I knew we were close.
So Andrew Huberman, I mean, he's got an incredible podcast when it comes to these types of things. But he mentions, in the morning, that's when you want to gulp water, you want to drink a ton, and then later in the evenings, that's when you don't want to necessarily be gulping, you want to be, sipping. But it makes a huge difference in energy levels there. Another one, I guess we both drink coffee. I'm not sure how many cups you're having a day, but I'm having probably a few too many when it comes to coffee, to be honest. The natural sunlight.
Actually, by the way, this is a great opportunity. By the way, I should share with you, Will. I moved completely away from coffee like 2-3 years ago.
Oh, really?
And I completely shifted over to tea, actually. But I shifted over to this is a great opportunity to plug a sponsor that's not going to pay either of us. But there's a great company called Zest Tea. Highly recommend to any entrepreneurs. It's actually 25 to 30% more caffeine than coffee, but in a much easier form on your stomach. So you're drinking it in the tea. Sidebar.
Wow.
But
okay. Interesting. So it's like 150 mgs per cup.
Yeah.
Roughly, probably.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm gonna send you a bag of it, Will.
Okay, I would love that, honestly.
It makes a huge difference, man.
Yeah, I drink, like 5+ cups a day, of coffee. So I'm heavily caffeinated. In terms of the sleep routine, I'm not as good in terms of like shutting off early. That's probably one thing. Like I'm not as cognizant about like my blue light intake. I do on my phone have it where it's just always in the orange light mode or like the bedtime mode, just so it's not, I don't know. That was like the one change I made, but outside of that, I don't really think too much about it. Yeah. Sometimes I take melatonin, which is probably not the best. If I know that, for example, I'm trying to catch up on sleep or I need to get to bed at a certain time, sometimes it's
Yeah,
hard to shut the mind off, which is probably why
totally.
you mentioned it's good to shut off a little bit earlier, like 4 hours before. But I always take magnesium, and that is actually,
Yeah.
I've noticed, has helped with my sleep.
Yeah, we all operate in different rhythms. I mean, again, I think it comes back to having a strong body awareness, right? So one of the things that I was going to share with your audience as well is I'm a big believer in health tracking too. So it's like I always look at it as like there's three components to most decisions we make in life is like we set it up, so we strategize on it, we build the SOP or the operational plan around it, then we do it and then we track it. But a lot of people are missing the tracking component. And a lot of people are also missing the setup component. Like a lot of decisions I find that people make in life, they just do it. They don't actually think about strategically how am I going to integrate this in my day to day? Because as we know, it takes, I think, about 2 weeks of doing the same activity before it becomes like an integrated routine in your life. So you have to have a really strategic plan for setting it up and then doing it, but then tracking it, right? So for me, I recently got this ring here. It's called an Aura ring, and it's very similar to what you're going to get out of like another form of a wearable, like a Whoop bracelet or an Apple Watch or something like that. But what this does for me, it just gives me some really high level tracking on some basic metrics that I would have otherwise never known. Like for example, it gives me a lot of data on my day-to-day activities, so heart rate, calorie burn, stuff like that. It gives me a lot of information on my overall readiness for the day, which is primarily correlated with sleep. But again, if we're not integrating any form of tracking into our life, then we're never going to know if the systems that we're putting into place are actually working, and we're also not going to know what we're missing. So when you talk about, Kyle, I have a hard time shutting off my brain at night. I would imagine if you start, and this is just based off really preliminary data, and also I'm not a doctor, but if I was hearing that from you, Will, because I'm the same way, man, is I would guess that you might have a circadian rhythm that operates, or you might have a chronotype that operates better in the evenings. So you may get spurts of creativity and energy from 6 to 10 p.m. when most people want to use that time to cool down. Right. So there's also a reason to say that you determine where you operate best at, you take advantage of those hours, and then you just shift your hour, you shift what would be normally someone's bedtime to maybe sleeping a few hours extra in the morning, which is completely okay. The biggest problem I see entrepreneurs miss, though, is that a lot of us are late night hustlers, right? We like putting those extra hours in the day, but then we also feel like we need to be up by 9 a.m. to take every call. And that's just a huge missing component of people's priorities. I feel like people will prioritize more often than not, entrepreneurs will prioritize their business above their own health. And that does no favors for anybody. And the most tactical example of that I always explain to people is like, okay, so you're going to work till 1 a.m. and then you're going to somehow get up at 6 a.m. and you're going to start taking calls at 8 a.m. Well, I'll tell you one thing, you're not going to be effective on those calls. And even if you think you're effective on those calls, how much more effective would you be if you were relaxed, if you were well slept, if you had a nice workout? How much more could you get done? So your efficiency drops by 50%. So I'd rather cut my overall workload by half and get the same amount done than do twice as much with 50% efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's one thing that I noticed. What it sounds like you're talking about really is just finding a way to audit the habits and things that you're doing and how they're affecting your performance. And that's one piece where I noticed that, for example, if I was doing my journaling at the end of the day, sometimes I would miss it versus when I would do it at the beginning of the day. And it was just part of my routine. I was doing it right after the meditation before I could go into work. Once you put that rule in place, all of a sudden, like you'll start hitting the mark. And it was another thing for me that I've heard from other entrepreneurs that some don't like it, but then some like swear by it. And I had never tried it until recently, which is just time blocking your calendar.
Yeah.
And at least for me personally, I know it's not for everyone, but for me personally, that was so huge because not only did it make it where, because when you're in those lulls where there's some time in between, but you're not sure, there's so many things as an entrepreneur that you can do and you're not sure where to put your time. Just having that time block of having that intention the night before, just ending my day, planning my next day. So when I wake up, I'm not all of a sudden just trying to figure everything out. I know exactly how my day is going to look. And then if I have an idea during my meditation or I want to do something else, I can always change it around. But then I'm not
100%.
having other things thrown on my calendar. I know what I'm going to do. If there is one of those weird 30-minute blocks where I can't actually get into flow or deep work, I know that, hey, I can just knock this out or this thing that I need to get done. And it just, I don't know what it is, but it gives me more energy just knowing, okay, this is what I got to do versus just constantly going through this juggling act in my mind and just having a to-do list. Because with a to-do list, it's a lot more difficult because there's so many things on the to-do list. And then you're wondering, okay, well, which do you want to do? Some of these you would much rather do. Some of them are more difficult and you don't want to do. One other like side note that I've noticed is a lot of times if there's something that you know that you should do and you're not wanting to do it, that's probably the thing that you should go do. And unless
Yes.
at least for me, unless I was time blocking, I'd be like, oh, I'll do that tomorrow. Like, and you should
Yep.
do it. So
Yep.
just like all these like little things that, you kind of just figure out what works best for you. And I mean, my routines have changed over time, but there are just consistent things, which is like sleep. You mentioned like learning things, like as you sleep. I mean, it is so true. From an athlete's perspective, you've definitely felt it if you're an athlete out there listening, where you will try and do something, you'll work on it, you won't get it. And then the next time you show up to do it, you're just smacking it, doing exactly what you couldn't do when you were practicing. It's because when you're not working, when you're sleeping, you're just going through the motions. You're finding out a way to get it done. And I think that's one of the most amazing things as well as an entrepreneur, is you just realize that there are certain things that you're just going to pick up. And if you put habits into place, things just start to work over time. What I found is really good for me personally, like with productivity, is fasting. So I will just work all day, I'll fast. And then at the end of the day, when my work is done and, it's time to feast, that's when I'll feast. And so that's kind of been like how I've approached it. But right now, I'm cutting in a way, I would say. Like normally I'm not like ultra strict where I'm only eating certain foods, but right now I'm eating a little bit less. And because of that, I'm eating less protein. So now throughout the day during my fast, I'll have a protein shake that has like 60 grams of protein, and I'll just have that with some water. And so that's what, I mean, I had one like an hour before the podcast. So that's kind of my new like type of routine. Like if I've got a podcast recording, I'll have one like an hour to 2 hours before the podcast, and then just eat everything at the end of the day. And I'm just hitting chicken thighs, salad, and low calorie barbecue sauce on protein wraps.
Yeah.
And that is all, because I just know that there are certain foods that I love. And I love chicken thighs. I love these different salad mixes. And then I love the low calorie barbecue sauce. And then there's so many different types of seasonings because we have the seasoning rack. So then I'll just try different types of seasonings every single day. So I still get the variety of the foods that I like, that have really good macros. And and it's been really great. Like I've really enjoyed actually eating like this, because I don't know, I just feel a lot better too. I just have more energy, and I also really like the foods that I've selected to eat. So it's been a pretty good routine that I've been in.
Yeah, it's amazing to me, man, like how deeply correlated what you put in your body, how deeply correlated what you put in your body is with what you put out of your mind, if you will. So like your inputs and your outputs are so tightly tied together. And when I was younger, to be honest, like it didn't really matter as much. I didn't really notice the impact of putting X food in my body means I'm going to get X more things done today, or fasting for X period of time is going to allow me to have energy that's going to allow me to push in the evening and close these 7 deals or whatever that's sitting in front of me, right? But as we get older and our bodies get weaker and more frail, Will, unfortunately, we're entering into that territory, the next 10, 20 years of our life. We have to be more and more cognizant as we get older about how we take care of ourselves. And it's funny because kind of going off of what you were sharing prior to our bathroom break after our dramatic amount of water consumption is, it's like entrepreneurship and life as a whole, to do it right, generally looks really boring. Right? Like to the outer eye, it might appear like the meals that you described sound really unexciting. Like, wow, well, you don't eat the entire day. You have a protein shake with water, and then you have a couple of low calorie, foods that you ingest in the evening.
When I hear it said out loud back.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't sound very exciting, but like the most successful people in the world have an extremely boring routine in terms of how they operate. Some of the best things that we can do as humans is get ourselves into regular rhythms and patterns in the way that we operate our lives, because our bodies function so well with consistency. Right? Like the more that I've learned about my body through like this Aura ring, for example, I just realized how much better I perform when I have the same routine every day, the same food in my body. I go to sleep at the same time every night. Your body thrives off that. We're creatures that are just built off what to expect, right? And if we know what's coming, our body does so much better preparing for it. And that also goes for what you were describing, Will, in terms of like structuring your day and time blocking and all that kind of stuff. These to me are like the are what can appear to be really rudimentary principles, because everyone's like, oh, everyone time blocks. Time blocking has been around forever, but do you actually practice it, right? Like, how do you actually integrate that into your day-to-day flow? How do you create uninterrupted time to complete your work? How do you limit distractions? Like, all of these things are all correlated, again, with consistency, right? And so when young entrepreneurs or young professionals or really anyone in my circle comes to me and says, Kyle, how can I get better in this area? I always go back to, can you stick with and maintain a specific set of rules in your life that you will adhere to no matter what? And if you can, on the other end of that is everything that you're looking for.
Yeah, it goes back to that Ray Dalio quote. I think that he said something along the lines of, you can have whatever you want, but you can't have everything. And I think that a lot of the times when you talk, just what you said with these habits, it looks very boring on the surface. These are the types of things that when you put them in place, it just helps you get so much more done. And going off the time blocking, in my calendar at the end of every day, there's the time block for me to set the time blocking for the next day. And
for the next day, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I do the same thing, man. Man, it's so critical. And that's another, I mean, I love that point you brought up in terms of like tactical ways that you can make real impact in your life. Planning your week and every day of that week. I usually plan my week from a high level. So I can kind of see roughly these, I really do it for each month, but weeks more specifically. So I can kind of see the rough flow of the week. And then, of course, every night before each individual day of that week, I lay out specifically how that day is going to flow.
All right. Okay. So I guess we could just dive into to the Bitcoin side now.
Oh boy. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So to make it, I think the conversation a little more interesting around the Bitcoin side.
Sure.
I feel like a lot of people, when they first hear like the word Bitcoin or hear crypto, it's almost like, okay, well, I don't really want to dive into this. There's just a lot to unpack here. It normally gets very technical very quickly. And so maybe the best place to start is, why do you think Bitcoin is important to the people who might not be in Bitcoin yet, or might not know much about it yet?
Yeah.
Like if you were to talk with one of them and try and say, hey, look, I know that this might not be your cup of tea. You might not be super involved in it, but why? But this is why you might want to pay attention, or this is what you might want to think about when you hear Bitcoin.
Yeah, and well, I'll use this as an opportunity to transition from what we were previously speaking about, because I am a non-technical founder in the Bitcoin space, right? And so I have a different perspective on why I entered in this space, and I definitely did not enter in because I was excited to read about the Bitcoin white paper and all of the various lines of code that have contributed to this project. That wasn't my initial draw. I've become more interested in that as I've gotten in the industry, but came here for a totally different reason. And initially I came here, kind of dating back to the journey into Frontier. Initially I came here because I just have a strong passion for helping build platforms to help other people launch off of, right? So my journey with Beats for Better that I was sharing earlier was ultimately to build a platform for young artists, creatives, et cetera, to be able to facilitate their creativeness and launch real businesses. And it was all about platform development for them. When I was building CEO during my late college years and post-college, it was all about building a platform for the more traditional tech entrepreneurs and other forms of entrepreneurs who were looking to launch their ideas from napkins into businesses. And then it got all the way over to the cryptocurrency space, and I started to get a little bit away from platform building. And I wanted to build a platform for myself. I wanted something that I could launch off of. And initially what attracted me towards the cryptocurrency world is that ultimately when you look at our society as a whole, we have a couple of big gaping problems that we're all going to be either dealing with tomorrow or in 10 years from now, right? And I've always felt that those fall into a couple different categories. We have political instability, we have environmental degradation, we have enormous amounts of social conflict, and we have centralized financial systems that have been proven to be breakable, right? In fact, we just have now seen, the timing of this podcast is great, March 20th, 2022, in case it's released later. It's important to reference that date because just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen some of the largest bank failures of our time, thanks to for the most part, broken centralized financial ecosystem. Now, does that mean that the system is so broken that you shouldn't trust banks? No, not at all. So if the government is watching, I'm certainly not saying that the centralized system is broken, but I'm saying that everything in our world is digital. Much of the digital world is slowly becoming decentralized. It's so natural for finance to fall into that realm. And what I think the most important thing when it comes to something like Bitcoin that's so beyond the tactical components of how Bitcoin is introduced is that we live in a world where not everyone has access to this great financial ecosystem that the US and its residents get to participate in. Even though our system is broken, we have a place that for the most part we can feel comfortable storing our funds. And even though money is not everything, money at the end of the day is ultimately what society has created as its key, really, for achieving your dreams. It's very, very difficult to achieve everything you want in this life without having some sort of financial stability, and in many cases, some form of financial success. And so for the dreamers out there who are like, I want to do it not because of the money, I want to do it just because I love the thing that I'm doing and I'm really passionate about this North Star. Remember that that although money is not everything, it's certainly something. And as my grandmother's always said, money's not everything, but it's certainly nice to have, right? And so because of that, we have to look at money a little bit more strategically as dreamers that are maybe listening to this podcast today, as looking at it as a really important key to our future. And so again, that gets back to how do we, if we know that money is an important part, it's not everything, but it's part of what we're trying to do, then we have to look at who is the stewards of our capital. Right. And that gets back to the dangers of the centralized system that we operate in, where we've seen that the stewards of our capital, the people that are holding our money, whether it be investors, banks, et cetera, maybe can't always be trusted. Right. Or maybe it's just the government that can't be trusted. And so if it's our money, but we're putting it in the hands of other people, and those other people we're not 100% confident in, then we need to re-control our funds. We need to take control not just of our life, which we're trying to do as entrepreneurs, but take control of the means to achieve our dreams. And in this case, those means are cash. Right. And so now the question you ask yourself, and the question that Satoshi asked himself over a decade ago, is how do we solve that problem? Right. We know that finances are the means to our dreams. We know that they're in the hands of people that we don't necessarily trust. We might trust them. Some of us fully trust them, but I know a lot of people don't. Right. Particularly young people that are rising in our world and seeing some of the economic challenges we're facing. And the best answer that we've seen to that question so far is Bitcoin. Right. We've tried to solve this problem before, but ultimately Bitcoin seems to be the best answer that we have so far. And so when I think about why Bitcoin matters, it matters for a lot of reasons. It matters for the reasons I just described, that we want to take control, again, of our life. And to take control of our life, we have to take control of the means to our dreams. In this case, finances are a part of that. So by controlling our finances, we control more of our life, and therefore can get closer to achieving our dreams. You can see how Bitcoin naturally fits into our day-to-day and why it's important. The second thing is that this goes back to something we shared earlier in the podcast that I was mentioning, which is everyone else's dreams, right? So we have our own dreams that we want to achieve through all the methodologies we spoke about in this call, the power of entrepreneurship, being able to have security and confidence in how we control our finances. But the second question is, how do we achieve everyone else's dreams, and why are those important, right? And everyone else's dreams, unfortunately, are not all afforded with the same level of opportunity and support that you and I see, Will, right? There's people, again, in places all around the world who don't even have the ability to even consider their dreams because they're so focused on just making sure the food's on the table, right? And a big problem with a lot of those people, and the reason that they're not able to achieve the success that we're able to, is because they're not able to tap into any financial systems that exist, right? A lot of success is built in the world, not just by making money, but by multiplying money. But if you don't even have the ability to access a bank account, how will you ever multiply your money, right? And again, that's where Bitcoin comes into the picture. It banks the unbanked. It creates new access to capital that enables new access to dreams. And by enabling new access to dreams, we now tap into untapped potential that exists all around the world, right? So to me, again, Bitcoin is so powerful for so many reasons, but the most important reason, in my opinion, is that it is an enabler of the global dream. Right? If we're contributing all of our collective dreams, goals, and visions into one unified global dream, Bitcoin enables us to get closer to that as a culture, as a species, as a race, right? And that's why I so deeply believe in it, because it ultimately puts control back in the hands of the people.
Well said. Yeah, Bitcoin, it's pretty incredible when you look at it from not just like the Western point of view, which, I mean, you mentioned this. It's crazy that there are so many places around the world where people just don't even have access to the basic financial systems that you and I or any of the listeners on this podcast have. I mean, we take banks for granted a lot of the times, because if you look at, let's say that you're living in, let's say that you were living in Ukraine, for example, when you were trying to leave the country. Bitcoin was saving lives there. Let's say that you're crossing over a border, you don't have documentation, you're not going to be able to open a bank account. You're not going to be able to take out a loan or do any of these things that allow us to go and actually build a company and go and interact with the world in a more efficient way. And at the end of the day, money is a game of trust, right? If you believe in the currency, that's what gives it value. When you see these countries going through hyperinflation, say you were in Venezuela and you were a very wealthy family and you had generational wealth, you saw that wiped out in a matter of months. Everything that your father's father, your father, and your entire family has worked for, gone like that. And there was nothing that you could really do. There were people that went and protected themselves in Bitcoin because for the first time ever, we've created a form of money that is not controlled by a single government, organization, person. And that's pretty revolutionary. It's the first time that you have money that's backed by real world energy. And if there's ever been just, signals in the world, whether it was with the money printing, with the virus, or with what you just mentioned, which is very timely with what's happening with Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate, many of these institutions that people, when you look at banks, you just automatically trust them. You realize that it's a house of cards. And I actually, before a separate interview, was looking into this, and the fractional reserve banking system, when you have, let's say, $100,000 in your account, the bank doesn't have $100,000 ready for you and every other depositor if you guys were to all go and withdraw your money. There used to be a law that made it where you need to have 10% of the money available and ready to go. So if there was $100,000 in your checking account, the bank would have to hold $10,000 on hand.
Yep.
In March of 2020, they removed that requirement. And so now the banks don't have 10% of your dollars on hand. And so I was curious. I was thinking, okay, well, how much do they actually have? I want to just have this knowledge for if it comes up in conversation. They're holding 0% of your funds on hand at any point in time. And when you look at these bank collapses, it shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, almost every single currency that's ever been created has failed. The majority of every single bank that has ever been created has gone under. And I think that this is just the ramification of what you saw after an enormous amount of manipulation to the monetary supply. You had these banks that are trying to make decisions based around some interest rate that the Fed's putting forward that no one knows what they're going to do. Like, people are literally analyzing, oh, well, he was wearing this type of tie and this color, and then he's going to do this or that. Like, this is just ridiculous. Like, it's like a clown world that we're going and looking at what these people are wearing to determine to try and guess what they're going to make the rate that's going to completely pull the lever of the financial system. And it's like with Bitcoin, you know exactly how much Bitcoin is in circulation, you know how much is going to be in circulation. And these are written into code. It's not necessarily just some decision by some human or small group of people that's made on a whim. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's even more mind blowing when you think about the fractional reserve banking system having, 0% of your money actually in their possession at any given time, right? They're usually out trading it because they've got to make money too. You'd think that all of the fees I pay them would be enough, but they want even more. But it's even funnier to think that the money that you're putting in their account is not backed by anything either. So there's layers to this game, right? It's the money that I've even received in the first place is not backed by anything, right? And then once I give it to them and I hand it over to a trusted institution, it's even further not backed by anything. Ultimately the whole line. If you follow the line of your cash, the only thing that you're betting on as an individual consumer is that the government's going to do right by you and that banks are going to do right by you. But the government and the banks never do right by us. They do right by themselves. They are businesses, ultimately. They're entities that have specific goals and purposes in mind. In this case of the government, they need to make sure that the country is ultimately profitable, right? And if they find that it's not a profitable country, just like a business, they're going to make sure that they find ways to make it more profitable. And if that means charging more to the end consumer, then they'll charge more to the end consumer. And the same case for banks. The interesting thing about Bitcoin, like you described, is that we don't have to worry about trusting anybody. Right. And so for the people that are new to the space, for example, the most powerful part about Bitcoin is that like you said, it's written into code. But as we're learning, code is so much more cemented than law is. Right. Because there's always a way to negotiate through a certain law. There's always a way to bring the right lawyer on board. There's always a way to pump cash into a politician's pocket. None of those exist in the space of Bitcoin because it's all decentralized entities that are keeping Bitcoin alive. Right. So there's not a single entity that you can go to and say, hey, make Bitcoin do this. And the most important thing is that even if you did tell a centralized entity, hey, do this to Bitcoin, like, for example, go to a large holder of Bitcoin and say, liquidate all of your Bitcoin and crash the price. Even if you said that, the rest of the world would see exactly what happened. So it's really easy with a fully transparent ecosystem to remove all bad actors because the community is reliant on itself. Right. And I think that's going to be the most powerful component of decentralized applications, not just necessarily in the Bitcoin space, but in all spaces. They're going to evolve beyond Bitcoin into all of the applications of blockchain. I've seen so many interesting projects, even when it comes to something like the internet, right? The internet is a centralized source. You were sharing about, relies on a centralized source. You were talking about what was occurring in Ukraine and how the power of Bitcoin was really relevant for them, right? Because they had to put their funds into some sort of centralized currency, right, to some degree. And they chose Bitcoin, which is centralized in the sense that you can own a single Bitcoin, but not centralized in the sense that it's being run by a decentralized ecosystem. But then you look at the internet in Ukraine. They were at a point where they had zero communications in Ukraine. Now, Elon was kind enough to go connect them with Starlink, which is now forming into its own decentralized internet. But I was a really big fan of another project in blockchain called Helium from a couple of years back that was starting to rise in the rankings that was designed to be a decentralized ISP as well. And it was going to go allow people to power all of the nodes of this internet service that they were looking to provide by basically allowing anyone to have a router that essentially sits on the roof of their home. And if you connect enough around a certain neighborhood, you can all of a sudden tap into the internet without ever needing to go to a centralized provider like a Cox or a Charter or whatnot. So I'm just a big believer that ultimately, like the secret to a lot of our problems relies in numbers. It's a strength in numbers. It's a peer-to-peer game. Bitcoin's a peer-to-peer money system. Helium was a peer-to-peer internet system. That's where we're going to ultimately find the solution to these problems. We need to break down these entities they appear a lot bigger than us, but when we bond together as people, we will always outnumber any financial system, any centralized system that feels like an overlord.
Yeah. So let's say that we go back in time and we're speaking to Kyle and Will pre-2020, pre-crazy monetary policy. I mean, even at that time, or I shouldn't even say even at that time. I should say at that time, if you told Will and Kyle what was happening today, even with us, with our creativity or thinking about these possibilities and how far governments can overstep, I think that you and I would both disagree that they would be able to lock people in their in their houses. They'd be able to really command the type of control over the population that they ended up commanding. And so right. My question to you is, right now you're seeing this firsthand, and every single person who's listening is seeing this firsthand, where you're seeing your dollars buy less, even in the West. The US dollar, which is seen as the gold standard, prices have gone crazy. And this doesn't seem like something that's going to stop. Inflation, even the target, even if you're hitting a 2% inflation rate every single year, you're losing a ton of your money over a 50-year period. But even if they hit that, you're just watching your wealth pretty much evaporate in front of your eyes. And so what entrepreneurs do and people in finance who are trying to protect their money, they're looking at the landscape. And after you evaluate, you try and figure out, okay, well, how can you protect your wealth? And not saying that this is financial advice or anything else like that, but what I do want to ask you is how you're looking at the landscape today, and if there are any types of insights or things that you've noticed that you think it would be valuable for anyone listening to hear from you.
Just in terms of the financial ecosystem, or in terms of just like how to operate in the world today?
It can really be either. You can take the answer however you'd like. Like one could be, okay, well, you think it's important to have like certain allocations somewhere, or you could just say, look, at the end of the day, this is the lens that I look at it through. This is how you might want to, like, any type of takeaways or things of value that you think anyone listening might want to hear.
No, I completely hear where you're coming from. The reason I ask that is because I think there's a greater there's a greater item that you can incorporate into the way that you process decisions in your life beyond just what is applied specifically in the Bitcoin space. I think what we've been taught over the last couple of years is that centralized institutions can be our friend, but ultimately do not prioritize us. They are always going to prioritize the health of their system before they protect the individuals that make up the system, right? And so when you looked at something like COVID, there was a general message to protect the country, but when it came to protecting our individual lives, freedoms, liberties, and so forth, the protecting of the country, which I put in quotes because you'd think that protecting the country means protecting its people, there's not always alignment between those two. And ultimately, the reason that we felt so many people felt like their rights, their liberties, their freedoms, et cetera, were infringed upon during the COVID time is because all of our rights, liberties, and freedoms are directly correlated with a centralized institution, right? So the question becomes not necessarily what makes Bitcoin great, but how do we as people decentralize ourselves, right? And I think there's a lot of different strategies that can be done for this. But I was listening to a really interesting podcast the other day of a former, I think he was a former Army Ranger who came out of the Army, went into civilian life, and he was like, wow, people are so incredibly underprepared. They rely so heavily on centralized institutions to protect them and to allow them to live the life that they are able to operate on a day-to-day basis. But imagine if you were in a car crash, and just ask this to an average person on the street. You're in a car crash. You crash a car, you've got your wife right next to you. She's got 5 minutes to live. If you're able to get an ambulance there, theoretically, to provide a tourniquet to an injury on her chest, she survives. If the ambulance does not get there in 5 minutes, she dies. So that's how heavily we rely on these centralized institutions. We are so reliant on, for example, the hospital system and the emergency response system that we have in the US that we will cut it that close, right? And most people will say, well, if there was a scenario like that, I would call 911 and they'd get there in time. Well, what if they couldn't get there in time, right? That's how tightly we rely on these centralized systems. And so I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how are you decentralizing yourself? How are you de-risking yourself from institutions that we are supposed to rely on, but have been proven to be ones that we can't always rely on? And these appear in a couple of different ways. So I think the most important ones is we have to break it down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and just start with the essentials. Are you able to provide shelter for yourself without a centralized institution supporting you? If you live in an apartment complex, a condo complex, if you live in a house that has a mortgage on it, it is not yours, right? So no, you're not able to provide shelter to you. So that's the first you have to ask yourself. How can I fully 100% own the shelter that protects me? And for most of us, that's going to appear in, at some point, completely owning land in a home. Now, does that mean a government can't come in and take your land and your home? No, but it puts you in a better position than most. Certainly a better position than someone that's renting a home, for example. And I think the really, really, really high net worth, ultra off-grid people I've met will actually go and set up homes in different countries that they own 100%, right? So that if a government decides to use some sort of policy to be able to reclaim land that your home's on, you always have a contingency plan. So that's a big one that I focus on. Then I start thinking about food, right? We're incredibly reliant on centralized systems for food. But as we learned during COVID, what happens when Uber Eats, Postmates, and grocery stores are not available to us? We can go hungry pretty fast. I would imagine that even on the average supply of food in an American's home, maybe a week or two before they're dead, it's not much time, unfortunately, because we're so heavily reliant on centralized ecosystems. So the next question I'd ask you is how are you self-sustaining yourself when it comes to food production? And then, of course, water production too. These are so many things that we just, we just take them as being, we really take a lot of them for granted, ultimately. But as we learned during the pandemic times, they can be cut off quite quickly. So you work yourselves through those different layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You'll eventually work yourself to the financial ecosystem. And the best answer we have for now is moving towards something like a Bitcoin. But, the question of can I detach myself from centralized ecosystems? I just don't feel like is a question that many people are asking themselves. And the big concern that a lot of survivalists have is what happens when shit hits the fan. Right? What happens when we have another pandemic? What happens when we have fires that burn through California again? What happens when we have temperature swings in Colorado Springs from 40 degrees one day to 80 degrees the next day? And these are all examples I'm giving that have all happened in my personal life over the last 5 years. So clearly, we're living in a time that's got some instability to it. And how are you going to protect yourself against that all? It's probably ultimately going to look like something associated with detaching yourself from the centralized ecosystems, and that is the case for Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's wild to see how many people over the past few years have suddenly realized what they thought that they owned, what you thought that you had complete control over, might not necessarily be yours. And it didn't matter if you were, someone who didn't have a dollar to your name versus a Russian oligarch. Anyone can seize your assets. And we've even seen it with countries. Like we've seen us taking away money from countries that thought that they had foreign reserves in dollars with the US, just having that wiped away. And so I think that at the end of the day, what the message I'll leave people with on the Bitcoin side, if they haven't really looked into it that much, is Bitcoin is the only true asset that you can 100% own where you don't need to rely on a separate counterparty or third party. No bank can take away your Bitcoin, no government, no whoever. If you have the private key to your Bitcoin wallet, that is your Bitcoin and you can access it from everywhere. And so maybe I should have made that a little bit more clear earlier when we were talking about the people in Ukraine. If you were living in Ukraine and you were trying to go to the bank and you were trying to take out your money, It's like, you see that you have $100,000 in your bank, you're trying to withdraw it. Well, it's very, very upsetting to realize that that is not your money, and you might not be able to get out of the country. You might not have access to any capital. And that can mean, the difference between being able to buy food, being able to buy shelter, being able to buy your way out of a country that is in the middle of a war. And so,
it's the difference between life and death ultimately, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is it's never a problem until it is, And so
exactly,
with Bitcoin, it's always nice to be able to say, look, you can protect generational wealth much more easily. Name a place around the world where you could have had gold, like $1 billion in gold over 100 years. Like, even in the US, you couldn't have done that because they confiscated the gold at one point. You look at any currency, almost all currencies over time fail. And it sounds crazy to talk about this stuff right now because this is just so detached from all of our everyday lives. But at the end of the day, at least just understanding that there are some of these dynamics at play, it might make sense to have a little bit of Bitcoin in a Bitcoin wallet that you control, just as a safety precaution.
100%. And I totally agree with you. And you use the example of Ukraine, which I'm sure many listeners can say, well, Will, that's an extreme example of a country that's in a war-torn scenario. But let's use an example of that looks totally different than that. Like, you take Canada, which is generally a peaceful country, generally a happy country. They had riots a couple of years ago where truckers were going on strike because they felt like they were underpaid. And the government said, we're going to disable your access to your personal funds if you continue on this strike. And they did. And there were truckers that went to their bank account and they tried to withdraw funds from their ATM, and the government said, no, you can't touch it. So nothing is in your control when it's not in your pocket, ultimately. And this, again, doesn't just apply to finance. It applies to everything beyond. But I think your point is really well taken. I feel like a big virus in our society is that we do not deal with a problem until it appears on our doorstep. We don't, for example, to all my friends in Los Angeles who live in the Malibu area, a fire wasn't a fire until their house was burning down, right? But they knew they lived in an area with extremely high brush and extremely dramatic temperature swings in the summers. They knew that going into it. But again, a fire is not a fire until your house is burning down, right? And that's the danger that we walk into as we go into a more unstable society in the future is, how are we going to make decisions that are not protecting problems, not protecting us against problems that we may have tomorrow, but protecting us against problems that may happen in 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And the reality is, if you want to protect yourself from a problem in 30 years, make decisions now to be proactive about protecting yourself from that problem. Because if you realize that problem exists, even in 10 years from now, it's going to be more expensive, more resource intensive to protect yourself from that problem.
100%. Well said. I'm really glad you brought up the trucker situation in Canada, because 100%. It's one of those things that it's always someone else until it is you. So it's a lot easier for the people in the U.S. or wherever to relate in the Western world to relate to a country like Canada that traditionally you'd think has very good rule of law and that you're protected under. So the last question that I wanted to ask you on Bitcoin, and this one. It's a price action question, but you don't have to answer it in a price action way. So the question is, the question is your price prediction for Bitcoin, or if you don't want to give a price prediction for Bitcoin, you could give a really long-term price prediction. Just give it whatever time period you want. I'm someone where I believe it's very difficult to make a short-term time prediction, but I can make longer-term predictions just seeing, okay, this is where the puck's going. The one other piece as well that I wanted to, before you answer that, is to ask you, for everyone listening, if they want to follow what you're doing, support what it is that you're working on with Frontier, or anything else that you just want to share at this point in time, where can they stay connected with you?
Yeah, absolutely. They're two great questions. Well, I think we really hit the point home in the importance of becoming decentralized from centralized institutions and the power in Bitcoin doing that. And ultimately, in the case of Bitcoin, you can tie a quantitative value to the amount of decentralized activity that's occurring, because typically the higher the price of Bitcoin, the more people that are participating in the network, the more people participating in the network, the more people getting into a decentralized space, and the safer that our world ultimately becomes. So when I see the price of Bitcoin going up, it doesn't just mean to me, oh, great, my portfolio is up 5 or 10% today. What it indicates to me is that we're having a greater global awakening towards decentralizing away from systems that could potentially hurt us, right? So to me, it's much bigger than just the amount of dollars that appear on the screen. That being said, in terms of where Bitcoin can go, given that philosophy that I carry towards it, the sky is the limit for Bitcoin ultimately. One of the most unique aspects of Bitcoin, and is ultimately the driver behind price. Unlike many assets like the US dollar, the more people that participate in the US dollar, it doesn't necessarily mean the dollar's value is going to increase. Why? There are theoretically unlimited amounts of dollars that are out there. We got off the gold standard a long time ago. As we were sharing a few minutes ago, we don't even really have a set amount of dollars that your bank is going to protect. So theoretically, like the dollar is just it's an infinite currency, right? Meaning that it has value because someone says it has value, but practically speaking, it doesn't have value at all. Because there's not a limited number of supply of dollars that are out there. Whereas on the other hand, Bitcoin is sort of interesting. The reason we see a direct uptick in the price of Bitcoin when more people participate in the network is because there's only a limited amount of Bitcoin that will ever exist, 21 million to be exact. In 2140, the last Bitcoin will ever be mined, meaning that we'll have a legitimate, fully capped currency at that point. But even within the next 12 months or 13 months from now, we'll be entering into the halving, and the number of Bitcoin that will be released into circulation every day will be cut to half. So when I think about where Bitcoin goes, anything that is supply capped is theoretically going to have no ceiling to what its price value could become, right? A price value of Bitcoin is going to be dependent upon, of course, number of people that participate in it, amount of Bitcoin that can be, the how we value Bitcoin in terms of its value against a currency, and if currencies. The one problem with valuing Bitcoin against in comparison to a fiat currency is that fiat currencies don't have really any true value to them. So it's difficult to price Bitcoin in terms of dollars, especially, again, when we look at dollars specifically being a currency that's just continuing to become devalued over time. So I always have a hard time pricing it in terms of dollars. But in terms of what the value of Bitcoin will be in dollars at least for the short term, because again, I have a hard time with long-term price predictions because of the devaluing of the US dollar. But short-term price prediction, I can dial that back in for you, Will. I would say the best data point that we can use right now is how Bitcoin is performing in the face of a really disrupted centralized financial ecosystem. And it's proven itself time and time again to be a safe place for money and a safe harbor for capital during challenging economic times. So we saw this during COVID, of course. There were a lot of concerns about, concern about the Fed money, the federal money printer is the best way to describe it. There were a lot of concerns about inflation. People turned to Bitcoin. Bitcoin was a safe harbor during COVID times. And that proved to be something that stretched globally. So I think that's a fantastic use case for Bitcoin's value long term. I think the second fantastic use case is what we've seen post Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate, First Republic, et cetera, all these various banks that we're seeing slowly collapsing. Bitcoin has responded positively, right? I think it was 2 weekends ago we saw 1 million new Bitcoin wallet addresses were created, and that was basically the same weekend as the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. So it's obviously a great place to put capital in the midst of greater macro financial uncertainty, and that drives up price naturally. To give a shorter term prediction of what I think that will mean, I don't necessarily think that Bitcoin in 2023 is going to be a $60,000 asset again. I think the primary reason why is that there's just greater macro uncertainty, and Bitcoin is still not a complete inflation hedge. Bitcoin does still trade like a risk asset, typically trades with stocks like what you're going to see in technology. And during uncertain financial times, people are not typically going for high risk assets. It's just the reality of it. So I don't necessarily know if Bitcoin is going to pump forever today. I think the other challenge with Bitcoin right now is that because it's being traded on Wall Street, there's a blessing and a curse to that, right? Which we saw as the advent of major financial institutions coming to Bitcoin in 2021 and 2022. It was great for the ecosystem because it provided a level of credibility to what we do, but it's not so great because now it gets traded like a stock. Right. And so I think we have short-term volatility, no question, because of macro market conditions, because of the large amounts of institutional capital that's in the Bitcoin space. Long-term value, I think, is going to be more closely correlated with, again, the supply cap of Bitcoin, the long-term value of being a decentralized currency. And my last note is where we go with price. Yeah, I mean, the only data point that I'd tack onto price right now is that we know that Bitcoin traditionally has a 6 to 7x increase post halvings, right? We have a halving that was in 2020 that led to the $60,000 price point for Bitcoin in 2021. We'll probably see something similar 2024 to 2025, I would suspect, with an April 2024 halving. So what does that mean? Again, I'm not good at price predictions, but if I was to guess, I would say Bitcoin probably hovers between 20 to 40K leading up into the halving. Bitcoin post-halving, I think it could be a six-figure asset post-halving, but that's about as specific as I'll get.
The last topic that I want to touch on in this episode with you, Kyle, is artificial intelligence. I've been secretly just waiting for this part the entire episode. I actually have some questions here.
Yeah.
But I guess the easiest question that we could probably start with is almost leave you an open floor and just stream of consciousness. What are your thoughts on all these advancements happening in artificial intelligence right now? Because it's really been an absolute whirlwind, I would say, for the past like 3 months. And I know that you have been, as myself, as well as myself, have been following artificial intelligence and been thinking about it, talking about it for, at least, when was our last podcast? Like a couple of
a couple of years ago.
Yeah, at least a couple of years we've been thinking about these topics,
Yeah.
whereas the general public is now, I would say, starting to hear more about it and get dialed in. So just your general thoughts to start.
Yeah, general thoughts are very, very, very general, because I think that we're starting to see a lot more tactical applications of artificial intelligence. And so when you think about the bigger, greater picture here, it's a wide angle that I look at it from, in terms of what does this actually mean for humanity over the next several centuries, right? And ultimately, it comes down to the question that I had briefly touched on earlier in this podcast, which is we are at what appears to be the end of the evolutionary cycle for beings on Earth, right? There's not necessarily going to be significantly better fish, mammals, et cetera. They sort of reach their ceilings in terms of optimizing the current resources that are available for most life on this planet. And for humans, you could make an argument that we've optimized our resources as well, and there's not necessarily going to be an evolution of the human. Right? We may get a little bit smarter and a little bit faster, but the reality is that for humans to become stronger and more evolved over time, we're likely going to need to supplement ourselves with something else, right? And that's where artificial intelligence naturally fits in the picture, because one of the things that people that I find myself speaking to people a lot about is the fact that we oftentimes feel like things like AI and automation are not already that are not here yet. We talk about them as if they're a future concept. Well, what about when artificial intelligence is, delivering me the weather every day? Or what about when I go to a McDonald's or go to a grocery store and there's no cashiers anymore? And the reality is that all of that already exists right now. It exists in forms that we take in many ways as just being a part of our day to day. This very computer that we're on right now, having this podcast, Will, is already a massive step towards us leaning more heavily on technology as our crutch. A phone, an iPad, an Apple Watch, an Aura Ring. All of these different tools are all of a sudden starting to integrate us more with technology to the point where we're starting to sort of feel like a cyborg. I mean, how much less of a full human do you feel when you leave your phone inside and you go out for a walk? All of a sudden, you start to feel a little bit detached from yourself. I mean, I know for me, for example, I pour a lot of my mind into the notepad on my phone because my mind, I realize, is really insignificant and weak, and it needs an extra set of hands, essentially, to help to keep it operating at its highest rate of speed. Right? I mean, we're far more efficient as humans than we were 100 years ago, but a lot of it is just because technology's already been introduced into our life. So when you talk about my general thoughts on AI, I say, well, we're already far down that path. We're already deeply intertwined with technology. We already are part cyborg. Now, we might feel like we're not because I can remove this ring, I can throw my phone in the trash, et cetera, but it's just a slow process of the innovation diffusing where it's more directly integrated with our bodies. And we're not far away from starting to see an Apple Watch become a chip or an Aura Ring become a pill. These types of things are well within our grasp. And if anything, what the greater, bigger, more powerful minds of the world are doing is they're just warming us up to what that integration of human and technology might end up looking like, right? It wouldn't make sense necessarily to go directly from iPhone to take a pill in your stomach that analyzes your calorie consumption every day. So we'll go from iPhone to Apple Watch, and then we'll go from Apple Watch to a ring, and then we'll go from a ring to a chip, and then maybe a chip to I'm replacing my entire liver with a computer generated part, right? It's a slow process. So all that to be said, I think this is a natural evolution if humans want to elevate to the next area of whatever this evolutionary cycle that we're now developing on our own looks like. AI is obviously a significant component of it because our brains are weak and limited, as we've talked about a lot in this conversation. And for us to expand what will frankly become to expand the human consciousness, to extend the impact of humanity beyond the realms of this planet, is likely going to require some form of technology to do it. And it appears that artificial intelligence is our best bet for, again, as I shared earlier, hold on for Excuse me, Will.
Bless you.
One of the many inefficiencies of humans is that we have to sneeze on important conversations. But what I was going to share, man, is that I've spoken a lot about in this conversation this importance of carrying the torch of the light of humanity. And the reality is that the human body itself is not enough to do that. So we have to slowly over time supplement ourselves with more. We're already very reliant on the tools that we have around us. The next layer of tools will be more automation, more artificial intelligence, and then probably humans themselves on an individual basis starting to become part artificial intelligence and part human intelligence.
Yeah, if you take a step back and look at how good this technology has gotten, I'm not sure how many of the listeners have played around with like tools like Chat GPT, and the newest version 4.0 just came out for the premium subscribers there. But it is just mind blowing how good these tools are. I mean, when you just think about Google in and of itself in the early days, and even before any of this technology, it's pretty revolutionary, disruptive to the way the education system works, right?
Yep.
It's kind of silly that when you're in school, you're not allowed to use this tool that you're going to be using all the time when you graduate. And I mean, they're in a similar type of situation right now with Chat GPT, where the 4.0 just scored in, I think it's the 90th percentile for the bar. I mean, you're looking at the highest forms of education with some of the most educated people in the world taking this test that can't even do it. And that's what they spend all their time doing. And this thing's scoring in the 90th percentile. And when you take a step back and look at how quickly this tool is improving, and understanding just when you're building these models, one of the big limitations right now is really just data center infrastructure and like the compute potential for running this type of a model. Just the people who get good with AI and are able to interact with the tool quickly are going to be able to put so much or be so much more productive than everyone else that doesn't get to use that tool. Like, imagine if you are the only one in a world. I guess this analogy doesn't necessarily work, but imagine trying to compete in a world today without understanding the internet, right? If you're not allowed to have a website, not allowed to leverage any digital infrastructure, you're going to get absolutely smashed. And right now we're in a weird place where it's almost like that type of a step change, except we're not in a world where all the companies are leveraging the AI tools in a very efficient way. So the people who, if you go out there and you understand it early, this was one of the first things that I went to try and do after seeing how good it had gotten, where I took like a week and a half off of just pure deep work studying, trying to figure out how to interact with these tools, how to leverage it. Like, one of the cool tips that if you're listening, and I recommend you try this, you might have already tried it at some point, Kyle, but you can almost turn the AI into any expert in the entire world. Like, let's say that you're trying to build a nutrition plan, for example. Say, pretend that you're a professional bodybuilding coach who specializes in men's physique, and just like, now it's like that person that can give you advice and say, create me a diet plan, or create me a workout plan or create a workout plan for a man that has been lifting for 5 years, or just literally put yourself and you can consult with this AI as if it's the world expert. Pretend that you're world class. Pretend you're the best, world class CEO, entrepreneur in the world, and then work back and forth with it, communicate like it's a mentor in a weird way. And I'm not sure if like where this turns dystopian, because one of the things that I was thinking about, and I'm not sure if we had talked about it in our conversation, is where does that line get crossed, for example? Because I agree with you. I think that we're in a place where the technology is getting so good that human intellect, you can't compete with machines, right? You're not going to be a human and be a better calculator. You're not going to have a better memory. You're not going to be as good as the machine at a lot of things. So where does that line get crossed where it's just so much better than us? And do we have to merge? Like, you mentioned the concept of cyborgs. I completely 100% agree that we are already cyborgs in a big way. I mean, a human today in today's world that's connected to Google is a very different human than, hundreds and hundreds of years ago that had a different way of life, right? And today it really is. I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on this in terms of like, how does that get crossed, right? Like, how do we go from that phase of being a quote unquote cyborg really today with like low latency, like we're not automatically hooked up, to actually living in a world where their super intelligence. Because I think it's pretty clear if you really take a step back, we talked about being a speck earlier. When you're a speck, we have no idea how much information potential, how advanced a civilization could be because we're limited by our physical form versus a super intelligent level of intelligence in AI. They could do things that the smartest human in the entire world today couldn't even begin to understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what is your exact question there, Will? Because I have a couple thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, you can answer. I propose like 5 questions there, so that probably
no,
yeah,
it's
not
completely okay. I mean, there's so much to crack into with you saying that all. I think that. So I think the ultimate question is like, when do we reach a point where we no longer recognize ourselves as humans? Like, when are we that deeply integrated with technology that the singularity is our reality? And I will say that AI is really, really interesting. All these technologies are really interesting, but humans are not that interesting. And humans are going to have to use this technology for a long period of time before it becomes a part of our day-to-day cycles. I do think that we have multiple generations to work through before AI becomes a part of our day-to-day activities. I think that we will start to see significant use cases in low brain power activities. So, like for example, I could absolutely see AI doing things for us that aren't necessarily the most the best use of the human brain power. So, for example, like checking the weather, setting calendar appointments, sending emails. Basically, like let's start with what I described earlier as kind of the low impact tasks, right? So I think low impact tasks will be taken care of by automation and AI probably within the next decade, honestly. I mean, a lot of it already is taken care of right now with AI. Like AI can, for the most part, either complete my emails or write a large portion of them. A lot of scheduling can be done without ever interacting directly with the counterparty. A lot of even things like, for example, having food delivered to my house, groceries, cooking meals, all those types of things, like we can slowly start outsourcing, right? So again, I think what you're going to start to see in my more through my more rose-colored glasses is I do think we'll see a world where humans have the potential to be more full and complete versions of themselves, because a lot of the mundaneness of life will slowly be stripped away thanks to AI and automation. So I feel good about that. That to me is a really big upside of where automation and AI fit into this greater equation. I think that we're going to see humans reach greater levels of their potential. Now, that's just phase one, right? And that has already, again, started to appear in our day-to-day with something like, for example, like with Siri or with Amazon Alexa, or all these types of tools that have already started to integrate in our day-to-day. So that to me is phase one. Phase two is when we start to move out of that really like more general intelligence into more specific sets of intelligence, right? And we start to see, for example, higher paid jobs, higher paid work, higher paid laborers start to either rely heavily on AI or be fully taken over by AI, right? And that to me is more specific sets of intelligence. And we've already seen really small scale developments in those areas. But anything that can be done by a human that requires physical interaction with whatever the task is likely going to be the next layer. And so I referred to some like basic level tasks, for example, like grocery delivery, calendar scheduling, emails, and so forth. Now let's move into higher tier physical tasks. So let's talk about driving, for example. Let's talk about surgeries, for example. Let's talk about something even more complex, like flying a plane. Some of these higher tier, higher paid, physically demanding human jobs or human output will probably be the next logical tier that's taken over. I have a self-driving car. It's proven that car drives better than me. Now Tesla has just loads and loads and loads of data to showcase that their self-driving vehicles are going to be significantly better than humans on the road. And I'm sure we'll see that same sort of data set then stretched into the medical field and again, other fields of transportation, like I was sharing earlier. And then probably beyond that too, into more high-skilled physical labor jobs. I just get the feeling that during our lifetime, a lot of high-skilled physical jobs are no longer going to be required by humans. And so then that leaves us with the final tier, which is what about everybody else? So now that we've taken away, again, all of the day-to-day mundaneness of life, and then we've taken over all of these sort of high-skill physical jobs for humans, when you look at it, it doesn't leave a lot left for humans to do. Right. So now we're kind of in this gray area. Like, let's say, again, transportation's fully taken over, medical's fully taken over, food's fully taken over, day-to-day mundane tasks are fully taken over. Now we're basically left with where we started, which is that we have the ingenuity, innovation, and creativity of humans left, right? And so the ultimate question that a lot of people ask themselves is not, can AI do things that humans don't want to do? It's, can AI do things that humans do want to do? And for me, as an optimist, that's where the rubber ultimately is going to meet the road, and where humans will always retain some level of value over AI. I get the argument that AI can create art and create sculptures and create music and all of these different things. But I do believe that what makes those pieces unique, those unique outputs of humans, is the connection that all of those things have to people's souls. And I don't believe that the soul or that voice in your head or those downloads you receive from the universe or all of the intangibles of life will ever be able to be fully replicated by AI. I think AI can make it appear that it can do something that a human can do, but it can never fully produce something that's fully unique to the person that created it. And I think that's where humans will hopefully carry the light of their consciousness and the light of their race, our race, as far as we can possibly go. But everything that we want to do outside of those more philosophical, creative, and intangible realms will likely all be touched by AI and probably fully taken over by AI. But the reality is that will take a long time. Just like any other new technology, we think that it's going to appear overnight. It's going to take time to get fully integrated. There will be significant pushback from institutions that will be impacted by it. And it's not a question to me of if it will happen. It's just a question of how fast it will happen. And we're not necessarily the people that are going to make that decision right here on this call. But hopefully over time, people like you and I and other thought leaders in the world can help to shape policy, most importantly, around how these things develop, so that they can grow at a high rate of speed, but hopefully within a highly controlled, strategic, and intentional environment.
Yeah, it all kind of comes back to what you had actually mentioned earlier in the conversation when we were talking about the entertainment side, where there's always going to be creatives and their role in the future is going to become more and more important. I agree that especially in a world where these tools are very powerful, the creatives and the people who are building and leveraging those tools are going to be playing a very important role in society. But overall, I think that this is a great place to actually wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, man. This has been absolutely incredible. I always love talking to you, learning from you, and we're definitely going to have to get you back on the podcast at some point.
Yeah, I'd love it, man. Well, it'd be really fun to do the next one in person with a couple of drinks and just kick it back on the couch and just kind of see what we can come up with. I love what you're doing, man, with this podcast we've done with Saz Mining. For your audience out there, if you're curious what we're up to at Frontier, we're super easy to track down. Just frontiermining.com has all of our juicy information on it. You can get in touch with us via our website. You can reach out to me directly there as well. I'm not as heavily present on social media, and that's a whole nother conversation that we can save for a future podcast. But if you do want to track me down personally, probably at least for these professional interactions, best places to find me is either on LinkedIn, or you can also find me on Instagram, Kyle A. Herron on Instagram. And beyond that, we have an interesting road ahead of us, man. If we have these 2-year check-ins every once in a while, the conversation is going to look totally different each time, even with the same questions asked.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting that I kind of came to a realization with the other day is, we're almost the first generation where you can really like save this moment in time, save this conversation, and someone later on can look back on and see it, right? And so when I was thinking about this, I thought, okay, well, what would I give to be able to see a conversation that, my grandpa or my great grandpa had, or just any of the, people from history that you always read about, but you never really get to see. There's something different about seeing a conversation or getting to feel that essence or that aura. And I think it's just going to be really cool to see, I'm sure we're going to have many, many more podcasts over the years, and it'll be interesting to see how they change over time. And I'm excited to continue to follow your journey. I think that what you're doing with Frontier is incredible, and really, really glad that we've connected and look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. What you should do, Will, my last note here, man, is you should keep the same questions that you asked each guest and then come back to that same guest a year or two down the line and ask them the same questions again. It'd be fascinating to see how the responses change over time, because our world is just moving at such a quick pace, man. And I know that perspectives are shifting along with everything else that's happening in the world. So I know that the answers that I provided to some of the questions you posed on our last conversation probably look different than today. Lord knows 2 years from now, man. I probably will just have GPT come on and have this little conversation on my behalf. I'll just say, respond to Will's questions like I would.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely crazy. I'm excited to see how it goes, and we'll stay in touch with everything that's happening.
100%, man. Well, best of luck with the podcast, man. If I can support it all, please let me know. I've got a ton of smart people that I'm sure would happy to be on. So give me a holler if you need guests. And otherwise, man, have a great rest of your week, and we'll connect again soon.
And if you want to learn from Brad Mills' wild story going from rags to riches, click this video right here. You'll hear a true American dream story that ensures you won't ever get scammed again.
Inflation is transitory.